Europe in the West did not come easily into capitalism. It was dragged into it, bleeding and screaming. I'd like to dedicate this series to Mr. Bob Taransky, my high school Euro history teacher, who I first heard that phrase from as he began our section on the 30 Years' War. This is the story we want to tell with this series, specifically the story of the 30 Years' War and the apocalyptic wave of destruction it brought across Central Europe from 1618 to 1648. But more broadly, it's the story of the gleaming Terminator skeleton of capitalism and a state capable of imposing capitalism being ripped violently out of the fetid, decomposing body of feudalism during the long 17th century.
This is the story of princes and armies, of cool intrigue in royal courts and hot death on the battlefield, of people fighting for a world to come that would redeem the suffering of their lives. But it's also a remarkably familiar set of interlocking and escalating structural crises: climate change, financial collapse, pandemic, and a social fabric torn apart by rapid advances in communication technology. These times may seem remote, but this is also the story of the birth of the modern human subject out of the wreckage of the previous age.
But to welcome a new era, the past had to be destroyed. Through blade, through plague, through fire and brimstone and damnation. I'm Chris Wade.
I'm Matt Christman.
Welcome to Hell on Earth. On October 31st, 1517, All Saints' Day Eve, an obscure monk from the backwater German town of Wittenberg sent a letter containing 95 doctrinal quibbles to the Archbishop of Mainz, and later most likely posted these 95 theses publicly on the door of the All Saints Church in Wittenberg. Nobody could have possibly imagined at that moment, but that simple post would be the beginning of one of the most seismic shifts in thought, society, and culture in world history. Though our series focuses on the events that occur a century later, we have to start here with the Protestant Reformation, the protest movement within the Catholic Church that would grow into a full-on religious schism and eventually lead to the collapse of the idea of Christendom, which had united Western Europe for 1,000 years. So Matt, why do we start the story of the crisis of the 17th century in 1517?
The crisis of the 17th century was brought about by an array of structural causes, from the struggle for the various classes of a dying feudal order to control the levers of newly empowered dynastic states, to the Little Ice Age that deprived the system of the agricultural inputs it depended on. The people of the early modern period did not experience these heightening contradictions directly, but rather through the intervening institutions that substantiated their social and political lives. Of those institutions, none was more crucial in providing legibility to the quotidian reality of European life than the Church. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the Catholic Church embodied the spiritual justification for the rule of the congealing military noble class that had inherited the Roman state's defunct coercive power. The contradictions of a revolutionary creed based on universal love, justifying the violent rule of jumped-up bandit chiefs, was never far from the surface, but throughout the medieval period, the Church maintained its legitimacy by, among other things, monopolizing the ritual mysteries of Christianity. That monopoly was challenged in the aftermath of the Black Plague by the emergence of literate, urban communities who found themselves unable to sustain their commitment to church ritual absent the social rhythms of rural life that had dominated the previous centuries. By the time the crop failures and hyperinflation and military conflicts of the early 1600s began, the notion of Christendom, the Western Latin religious community that encompassed European people from Portugal to Poland, had been irrevocably broken into hostile confessional camps. The pain caused by the decay of the feudal order was expressed socially where it could be, through the creation of new and mutually exclusive conceptions of God. This meant that when the peasants and townspeople, knights and burghers, princes and nobles of the Holy Roman Empire came to open war over the spoils of a waning agricultural surplus, it would be with minds fired by conflicting visions of religious apocalypse and rebirth.
More simply and directly, most of what we want to talk about in this series will be done in the shadow of Luther, sometimes literally in his name, sometimes by passionate true believers, and sometimes opportunistically and for material reasons by those who found a justification or even cover for their motivations in the ideas about God that he nailed to that church door. In the next few episodes, we'll be moving backwards and forwards in history, giving more context about the political and social landscape of Europe that surrounded his life, and then followed directly from the ideas he unleashed. But we have to start with Luther, who had the right mind and critically was born into the right conditions to create a schism that changes the world that came before him into the world we have now. But only then, after much, much bloodshed. Martin Luther was a Chad. He was a pimp. He was an original five-tool player. He served, he slayed, he did not have to go that hard, but he put his whole goddamn Martin Lucy into it. This was a man who, if ever there was one, understood the goddamn assignment.
The original assignment understander has logged the fuck on. So great men, we all know, don't make history, but history does sometimes make men great. The social, technological, and economic conditions of Europe in the 16th century combined to create unprecedented pressures on the authority of the Catholic Church, and for a time, that pressure was contained almost entirely within the person of Martin Luther. It was Luther's particular and extraordinary combination of will and ability that focused that pressure onto the most vulnerable pillars of Catholic authority, and with a ferocious push, set about its collapse.
I think we can lay our cards on the table early here and say we are both big-ass Martin Luther fans.
I mean, he's fascinating, that's for sure.
I love talking about this guy. I love thinking about him.
He's one of those guys you look at and you can see, he's a Hegelian figure if ever there was one, embodying a historical moment. If Napoleon was history on horseback, then Luther is history on the toilet.
We'll get more into that in a little bit. Martin Luther was born on the 10th of November, 1483 in Eisleben, in the Saxony area of central Germany. His father had navigated the labyrinth of feudal debts and obligations to move from the son of a peasant smallholder to a copper smelter, eventually establishing a small but stable mining concern. Luther was sent to university in nearby Erfurt, where it was expected he would eventually study law and become a lawyer, improving upon his family's upward ambitions.
Luther's dad, by the way, was a sort of self-starter who made up the bulk of the advancing bourgeois of this period. He was motivated enough himself to take advantage of the loosening feudal obligations of life in rural Germany to save money performing agricultural wage labor enough to move to a city and invest the savings in a profitable business. And these are the people who are going to make the religious revolution that Luther ends up embodying, the urban bourgeois here. And for the Luther family's case, that investment was in the mining sector, which exploded during this period because of technological advances in mining technology. And so, in addition to making a bunch of fortunes of up-jump peasants like the Luthers, it also, along with all the New World metals coming from the Spanish and Portuguese colonial projects, together those things sparked a price revolution that filled the continent for the first time, really, since the fall of the Roman Empire, with hard specie currency. And that helped supercharge economic advancement during this period,
which had been stagnant for centuries.
Exactly. So while the Luthers are prosperous burghers and the patriarch Hans becomes a counselor in the town of Mansfeld, even then, though, their fortunes rest, as many bourgeois fortunes did, on a shaky foundation. Hans Luther never owned the mines he worked. He always leased them with borrowed money, and he was never able to actually pay off those debts until just a few years before his death. So he was clouded by the fear of bankruptcy basically his entire life. So the shortest path to secure a prosperous future for the Luther family going forward, for a family that did not have landed holdings, was the same one that was taken by most of the bright children of the emerging bourgeois.
And still to this day.
To this day. Get a degree and work for the imperial bureaucracy. Get a job as a lawyer within the Byzantine court structure of the Holy Roman Empire.
Right.
And through that public sinecure, raise the family's fortunes.
But as often happens to young men at a crossroads, torn between a professional life devoted to reason and the search for something more, Luther needed a little sign to show him the way. And in 1505, Luther was nearly struck by lightning, caught in a terrible thunderstorm a few miles outside of Erfurt on his return to school. Terrified, Luther pledged his life to God, if God would just spare his life. And he survived the storm. Within 2 weeks, he had quit his academic pursuits and joined the St. Augustine Monastery. Throughout his life, Luther was known as an intense, brilliant, charismatic, and gregarious man. To his friends and intellectual allies, he was dedicated, supportive, encouraging, and to his enemies and detractors, a capable, challenging, and sometimes vicious sparrer. To the many strangers he would encounter on his rise to fame, a friendly and winning conversationalist, instantly magnetic, and down for a good hangout bull sesh. But, most of all, Martin Luther had the fucking heart of a poster. Absolutely prolific, concise, in love with arguing, never editing, never backing down, never afraid to make ad hominem attacks and call his enemies stupid, evil, or both, and when pushed by an opponent into ever more radical points, never retreating, and in fact doubling down, making those new points bedrock positions in his philosophy and theology. A man born for the forums 500 years before they were invented. So, young Luther takes the tonsure and becomes a monk. His time is spent in long hours of praying, fasting, confession, maintenance of the monastery, and generally obsessing over God and salvation. Luther gave his entire life over to the strict structures of Catholicism, and indeed, Catholicism provided structures for the entirety of feudal social life. Matt.
Now, the Catholic Church maintained its monopoly on ritual Christian life through an ecclesiastical bureaucracy that ran from the triple-crowned Bishop of Rome himself to the humble parish priest. Like all institutions of medieval life, it was structured to reproduce the rigid structure of feudal class rule. High church offices came with high salaries gained through compulsory tithes and often claims to a portion of the peasant-produced agricultural surplus in land under their direct control. They were often purchased by members of the high nobility for themselves and second sons who couldn't inherit their estates. While celibacy was fitfully enforced, largely to prevent the hereditary control of church offices, familial dynasties could still be bred in the upper echelons of the church. Popes were known to appoint a cardinal nephew to high office at a young age to secure their interests. Uncle Magic has the sanction of heaven.
And when we get to the 30 Years' War, there's an important cardinal infant.
Cardinal infant.
Little baby cardinal, adorable, 17th century boss baby.
So for these high-ranking church officials, the average peasant or townsperson would have little interaction with them. Likewise, the propertyless sons and daughters of lesser nobility, who are often sent to spend a life in quiet contemplation as monks and nuns in cloistered monasteries and convents. In reality, the monasteries often operated more like frat houses, with drunk rich kid monks, fat off tithes and free from most labor obligations, running around the countryside, stealing chickens and seducing farmers' daughters.
There's a reason there's a whole genre of Renaissance paintings of fat, jolly monks drunkenly contemplating huge tankards of beer.
Yeah, the monasteries were fail-son refugees,
exactly.
Basically. Now, confession and preaching, the two church duties that we now associate with priests, in Luther's time, were largely carried out by friars who were sworn to various religious orders. They lived among the people in towns and used their advanced university knowledge to provide counsel to the flock. And at the base of the ecclesiastical hierarchy were the humble parish priests, the most humbly born and least educated clergy, but the ones charged with saying Mass and administering the majority of the 7 holy sacraments, the ritual points of contact between the infinite compassion of God represented by his church and the common run of sinning humanity.
These rites, these sacraments, guided people through the ebb and flow of social life. Baptism, welcoming new life into the church. Confirmation, establishing the individual as a subject of the church once they were old enough to comprehend it. Penance, through which transgressions were admitted and absolved. The bestowal of holy orders, by which the church built its bureaucracy and hierarchy. Matrimony, by which people were confirmed in marriage and thus in the community. And extreme unction, the final rites to the sick and dying. And the most important, the Eucharist, in which the church exerts its special ritual status, where priests literally transform bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, allowing people holy communion with God in this physical reality. The sacrament secured people in a cosmic order that ensured their eternal salvation, and as such bound them in gratitude and thanks to the church. At least, that was the idea.
Now, the sacraments were, for the most part, not inspired by any biblical scripture. They were practices that had built up over the long centuries of feudal development after the fall of Rome, when the church alone held social life together. a task that was made considerably easier by the creation and monopolization of ritual affirmations of religious faith.
Yes.
The church helped stand up the power of Europe's military aristocracy, but also competed for power with it. Not only did the Pope control the papal states around Rome as a direct feudal ruler, the church coexisted uneasily alongside dynastic rulers with their own claims to social authority in places like France and England. In the more loosely controlled German lands of the Holy Roman Empire, German bishops ruled over 25 major secular principalities, as well as numerous archbishoprics and abbeys. 3 of the 7 electors who chose the emperor were princes of the church. The intertwined secular and social power of the church only exacerbated the tension between embodying a faith that posited universal peace brought about by universal love and the renunciation of earthly pleasures, and administering the rule of a class of warmongering, luxury-addicted aristocrats, some of whom wore the vestments of the church itself.
By the early 16th century, though, this tension between godly and worldly power in the universally dominant church had begun to show some cracks. The previous century had seen a series of reform movements challenging church doctrine. The Lollards in England, the Cathars in southern France,
Albigensians, if you're nasty.
and the Hussites of Bohemia. To different extents, they all confronted papal authority and sought to reinvent the church in a way to bring lay people closer to the true Christianity.
Now, every sacramented religious order and practice that we've been talking about so far that were established as Catholic tradition by Luther's time, those were all developed by the church in response to different reform movements, to neutralize them and co-opt them.
Right.
That was their dialogue with this like fitful resistance to the contradictions inherent in this religious project. And these were the people who were trying to resolve the paradox of trying to live for Christ in this sort of counterfeit Christendom. And all of these elements that have been built up were done so to give people a greater sense of connection to the church itself.
Right.
That's like, it was the friars emerged, the religious orders emerge to speak to the spiritual lives of people who require some sort of understanding for why things are the way they are.
Yes. To literally crack open the manual and like give you tech support for the church.
Exactly. And so all of these things emerge, and they all emerge in response to these reform movements, some of them peaceful, some of them violent. And throughout the medieval and early modern eras, these movements keep arising to challenge the existing state of affairs, the society of orders that so constrained and exhausted the lives of an exploited peasantry and an oppressed urban population. But since the church dominated the European social vocabulary, resistance to the status quo invariably coalesced into critiques of the church itself. They mixed local concerns, like the Czech-speaking Hussites' alienation from a predominantly German-speaking episcopacy, with more radical visions that recalled the revolutionary promise of Christianity before it was assimilated into the power structure of the Roman Empire. Free and equal life as brothers and sisters in Christ, sharing alike the burdens of toil for the benefit of all. None of these movements were able to move beyond their parochial origins, however, thanks to the united, violent opposition of secular and religious rulers, as well as the absence of any mechanism for disseminating their ideas.
Yeah, you can't get very far with a protest movement when you just have to like tell a friend about it.
It's not going to work. Not when you likely don't even have access to a horse.
Yes. The Hussite movement, in particular, cast a long shadow over Central Europe. Following Jan Hus's execution for heresy in 1415, Bohemia would face 15 years of armed conflict between Hus's followers and a crusade launched to eradicate them by the Pope and Catholic rulers. The Hussites actually won this conflict and succeeded in securing some concessions from Rome for the free practice of Hussitism in Bohemia. So we see the beginnings of a worldly conflict here of just how powerful the Pope will be over these regional religious practices. But these guys are also obsessed with the minutia of Christian ritual. Like, one of the main things people will argue about, what Huss got himself burnt at the stake over, is the physical and spiritual nature of the Eucharist. Mm-hmm. Whether the bread became God, which is good and correct Catholic doctrine, or whether God became the bread, which is a vile heresy punishable by death. When Huss was in prison awaiting execution, he said, "I may be a weak goose, which is what Hus means in Czech language. But more powerful and far-sighted birds, falcons and eagles, will come after me. Incidentally, Hus's death by fire may be the source of the expression, your goose is cooked.
Yes. So the consequence of this distinction is that the Czechs demanded the right to take both bread and wine with communion, which had been denied them. And it became the rallying point for the entire movement. Massacres, battles raged for decades in the Czech Republic, Bohemia, over this question.
Yes, the ultraquist itself just literally means both.
Yes.
It's boathism. Give me the wine, give me the bread.
And so there is this ultraquist church that emerges, which is the Catholic Church and the greater power structure's concession to essentially Bohemian self-determination.
Right.
The Bohemian nation at that point is self-conscious enough to assert its independence from a centralized authority and elect its own king, for example, and also administer its own reformed religion within its borders. But of course, it only does that because it defeats within it the more radical side of Hussism, the Taborites, who were from the lower orders, who were opposed to the nobles, who were the ultraquist the ultraquist leaders, and fought them for decades, beat them many times, but were eventually overcome. And of course, then the real class-based element of this revolt that was always there is eventually extinguished, and leaving now a Bohemian church that is as much a machine to perpetuate social
Local
domination
nobility,
as the Catholic Church had been before it.
And you can see already in the ultraquism and the Hussitism, stuff that is going to be very important in this series is the unique linking in this time period between the cosmic questions of transubstantiation of God and communion with the unique political character of things.
Yeah.
It's no coincidence that Bohemia both gets its own king and gets its own religious order.
Exactly, because we're seeing the ability of people to express like a political project and political subjectivity for the first real time.
Right.
Because of the deepening of the process of urbanization and literacy, all the things we're talking about. But the only cultural language that is shared amongst all is the language and the vocabulary of religion.
Right. So then, there's one final piece of the pre-Reformation world we have to cover. Hell. Christian spirituality intimately wove the concept of eternal punishment for worldly sin and ritual absolution through confession to avoid it. By the late medieval ages, another concept had come to dominate the Christian mind: purgatory. The idea is an intermediary state of cleansing fire, where some souls who died in peace with God but still needing some purification are purified after death, and that the prayers and devotion of the living can aid this process along. This was very real, very heavy stuff for the early 16th century mind, and the sin, penance, purgatory chain was the currency of exchange, both spiritual and physical, between the church and the lay people.
Because the church's role in enforcing social consent rested on its promise of access to divine grace, it was commonly understood that very, very few people in Christendom would be eternally damned. Hell was reserved for witches, heretics, and Jews, those who consciously rejected God's love. People who were baptized into the faith and kept to its requirements could rest easy, knowing that they would eventually be reunited with God in the hereafter. Leave it to the priests to spend all day worrying about God and fretting about his desires and trying to see into the mind of him. As long as you went to church and did your tithing,
kept your head down, gave a little money to the church, saw the priest every week.
You didn't have to spend so much time tormented by the mystery, the unresolvable mystery of God.
Yes.
The unfathomable, horrifying mystery of God. We have structures that are imbued with real meaning to you that assure you that that work is being done elsewhere.
Yes. We're taking care of it. We're handling it.
And that is a huge, immense weight off. And
right.
I would argue that like the emergence of the neuroses of modern, secular Western identity is the imposition of this unfathomable, unanswerable question of God that we all now have to deal with as individuals in a way we never used to have to do. There was somebody else to do that.
And that is what this story is ultimately about.
Exactly. And it's that promise that we have people working for you. Like the customer service line to God is open. We are hearing you. We are valuing you. It's that promise of relatively assured salvation that is the spiritual justification for secular commonwealth and secular rule of the princes. It's the rule of the nobles that allows the church to extend God's grace to any willing soul in Christendom. Purgatory, then, was the spiritual justification for the institutions of the church itself. Easily accessible salvation, universal salvation, now that's a potentially destabilizing social force. The concept of purgatory evolved alongside the sacraments as one more bureaucratic hurdle separating man from God that man needed the church to help navigate. The relief of a quantifiable amount of purgatorial suffering for deceased loved ones could be had through pilgrimage to view holy sites and relics, the sponsorship of intercessionary masses, and for the people who lack the time and money for those sort of grand gestures, the purchase of certificates of indulgence, aka get out of purgatory early cards.
Ding, 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 indulgences.
If you had indulgences on your bingo card, cover it up.
Circle it now. So, we have this increasingly unstable church bureaucracy mediating ritual and secular life, and this obsession with the fate of the soul as an essential social force. The early 1500s also saw a paroxysm of conviction that the end of the world was nigh. Christian faith was infused with a strong belief in the apocalypse, the end of days, the return of Christ, and the judgment of humanity. But the conviction that such a moment was actually in the offing waxed and wanes with the tides of medieval and early modern history.
Early Christians had lived convinced that Christ's return would occur during their lifetime, but the adoption of Christianity by the Roman authorities had the effect of sanding down the religion's eschatological edges. Mm-hmm. But following the fall of the empire, the constant warfare, misery, and exploitation of life in so-called Christendom triggered a cycle of social agitation that pointed towards an apocalypse both feared and yearned for. The coming of the millennium, the 1000th anniversary of Christ's birth, saw a continent-wide spiritual agitation that was channeled by kings and popes of the Latin Rite into a war to reclaim the Holy Land from the clutches of Muslim infidels, and in so doing, hopefully bringing about Christ's return. They failed at that, but succeeded in securing a beachhead for Christian control of the Levant that princes and knights spent the next 3 centuries fighting to maintain. But by 1500, a date that was biblically as freighted with apocalyptic resonance as 1000 had been, the infidel Turk held not only Jerusalem, but Constantinople, and threatened the gates of Vienna.
The Turk!
The Muslim, the Ottomans!
They're in the continent! How can this be?
They're knocking at the door! The physical security of Christendom itself was in danger, and its secular rulers did not seem up to the task of defending it. Clearly, many Christians thought God's judgment was being rendered, and annihilation was at hand. The assurance of salvation offered by the church felt more and more like a hollow promise. There was an increasing sense that upon his return, Christ would not look with favor upon the works of his supposed faithful.
One thing that I've been thinking about in terms of trying to make this story relevant for modern listeners is by the time we get to the 30 Years' War, 1618, we are closer to them than they were to the First Crusade.
Jesus, that's true. Fuck.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's just a way to think about how relatively modern all of this is.
It's true, and everything's moving faster every moment.
So this is all to say that Europe in 1517 was primed for a rupture. The church, which had been the single force unifying these disparate political powers that made up Christendom, was under growing stress, its temporal corruption eating away at its spiritual authority. Its role as the intermediary between your soul and God was under question, and the power of the princes to secure the realm from the godless invaders was faltering. And so we return to the Augustine monastery in Wittenberg. Because on October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther sends his letter to the local archbishop complaining about the immodest sale of indulgences in the Holy Roman Empire. This letter contained a disputation of the power and efficacy of indulgences, a collection of proposals for a scholarly debate on indulgences now known as the 95 Theses. I think, inarguably, the most powerful single letter of all time.
The post of posts.
Yes. The theses were later posted at the Wittenberg All Saints Church door and quickly published in various cities in northern Germany. And though Luther initially intended his disputation as a means for scholarly argument in the church and aligned academies, and as indeed he had sent a similar disputation angling for a debate over scholastic theology just a month earlier. So the 95 Theses are really his second album, you know?
It's true.
Nobody remembers the first.
The first one flopped big time.
Yes.
It turns out nobody really cared about nerd-ass scholastic points.
Yes.
They wanted something spicy.
And they wanted something that was invested in their actual lives.
Exactly.
Yes.
Like, oh, you're telling me that these go-to-heaven tickets are counterfeit?
Yes. I've spent so much money on this. So even while he had sent this other letter a month earlier, the immediate insane popularity of the theses quickly escaped academic circles through this still relatively underdeveloped technology called a printing press. And as church officials began responding to Luther's prompts attempting to dismiss them, Luther himself made the critical breach of cloistered debate circles by replying in vernacular German with his Sermon on Indulgences and Grace in 1518. Recapitulating his 95 Theses into a pamphlet of 20 brief paragraphs, this was an immediate, massive hit, being republished throughout Germany, going through multiple editions in the first year, stimulating the entire German printing industry to the power of Luther. For many Germans, it was probably the first work of a living German author that they owned.
Martin Luther was a character type that is remarkably familiar to a modern observer. Not only did he have the combative and pedantic drive of a born poster, his relationship with God was recognizingly modern in its angst. The story of his conversion by lightning was likely true in some respect, but embroidered with the passage of time and the growth of the Luther legend. But his faith was never serene. Luther spent his early years as a monk struggling with a deep awareness of his distance from God, of God's fundamental inscrutability, and of his own felt worthlessness in comparison to him. Luther's mind was too restless to be satisfied with the simple articles of faith that the church existed to reinforce. A significant intellectual turning point for Luther and the generation of churchmen who would take up his banner was the 1516 publication of the renowned humanist Erasmus of Rotterdam's Greek translation of the New Testament. This book brought the scriptures to life in a way church intellectuals like Luther had never experienced before, and by seeing the Word of God in this new context, opened a chasm between the doctrines and practices of the church and the text that church was supposedly inspired by. There's no mention of purgatory or most of the sacraments within its pages. There certainly was nothing about indulgences.
So where did this shit come from?
Where did this shit come from? Well, Luther had been chafing for a while against the placid theology of the scholastics, which implied that salvation was available to all who performed the good works demanded by the church. It was the indulgence campaign in Saxony of the Dominican friar Johann Tetzel that provided the focal point for Luther's anger at what the church had become. As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs, is how Luther described Tetzel's sales pitch as he went from village to village, hawking indulgence certificates, the proceeds of which would help finish the remodeling of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome and pay part of the debt Elbrecht, Archbishop of the city of Magdeburg, owed to the Pope for the right to also claim the archbishopric of the city of Maine.
You're literally paying this guy to buy another archbishopric.
Yes.
It's wild.
It's wild stuff, folks. For Luther, the formal promise of indulgences to shorten the time loved ones spent in purgatory was bad enough, but much worse was what regular people, not inclined to inspect the fine print, thought indulgences were. In a letter of complaint to Archbishop Albrecht, Luther wrote, "I do not so much complain about the quacking of the preachers, which I have not heard, but I bewail the gross misunderstanding among the people which comes from these preachers, and which they spread everywhere among common men. Evidently, the poor souls believe that when they have bought indulgence letters, they are then assured of their salvation. In exchange for silver, the shepherds of the church were leading their flock into the spiritual wilderness. This all generated in Luther a profound sense of alienation. If the relief of suffering, supposedly the reward for a sincerely felt remorse for the commission of sin, could be purchased so cheaply, then how could the sincerity of anyone's faith be trusted? The truly contrite would recognize God's chosen punishment as justice. Only the false-hearted would seek to avoid the suffering that God had ordained as the true price of sin, and yet those were the people that the church now assured of salvation. On top of that was the assumption, anathema to Luther, that God's will could be swayed by the prayers of a priestly or even saintly middleman. Luther's disenchantment from the spiritual basis for church doctrine generally and the practice of indulgences specifically, as well as his ability to amplify that disenchantment into a continental movement, was only possible thanks to the advent of print technology. Luther read a printed edition of Erasmus's Greek New Testament. Print is how Luther was exposed to the humanist scholarship that convinced him that the donation of Constantine, the Roman imperial degree that ceded control of the Western Roman Empire to the Pope, was a forgery. Print allowed for the production and distribution of certificates of indulgence on a mass scale, and print gave Luther the ability to take his critique of the church beyond the ivory towers of theological disputation and reach a popular audience. This is why Luther called printing God's highest and extremest act of grace by which the business of the gospel is driven forward, and the last flame before the extinction of the world.
So now, while printing had been an established technology for over 60 years and had in that time been crucial in creating a new class of literate townspeople who were able to buy Bibles and religious commentaries by figures like Erasmus, it was still a relatively boutique industry, lacking a mass demand for products. If you were noble, you would buy some books basically as an ornamental thing,
Yeah. So as a flex.
Yeah, as a flex. Look at this. I got like 20 books.
Look at my shit. I got Virgil.
Gutenberg famously printed a Bible and then promptly went bankrupt because he couldn't get enough people to buy it. The number of literate potential customers for printed material was rising, but the business model of publishing discouraged all but a few centralized specialists to invest in it. Printing a run of books involved a significant upfront cost with no real way to anticipate how much public interest existed for any given book. And by Luther's time, most publishers kept themselves afloat by printing government documents and church documents, including indulgences. Before Luther, indulgences were like the number one thing actually printed by people.
Yeah.
In the 15th century, as many as 2 million certificates of indulgences were printed in Europe.
Individual pieces of paper just fluttering about the town.
And most other books were, as we mentioned, luxury goods for rich nobles or churchmen to showplace their libraries.
Yeah. Luther's incendiary critiques of the church created, for the first time, an expansionary publishing industry. The townspeople of Germany, many fed up in their own way and for their own reasons with the preachings and practices of the church, became a rapacious market for Luther's writings, which were designed to be digestible and understandable to a lay readership. The wide distribution of printing presses in Germany, in contrast to the concentrated printing industry centers of Italy and France, allowed for a rapid transmission of Luther's words to a hungry audience who proved quickly that they were willing to purchase anything with Luther's name on it. What topic could be more compelling to potential literary customers than the destination of their immortal souls? Presses popped up like mushrooms to cover the surging demand. Wittenberg itself had only acquired a printing press in 1502 as a vanity project of the Saxon elector Frederick. But soon the city became the heart of a North German publishing industry that flooded the empire with Luther's polemic. In the 2 years after the posting of the 95 Theses, Luther published 45 works, 25 in the theological lingua franca of Latin, 20 in vernacular German, put out 291 editions, 21 of them were 8 pages or fewer. All of them were filled with punchy, muscular, direct prose, perfectly calibrated to reach and affect a mass audience. Luther's theological insights could only be transformed into a creed capable of mobilizing vast forces against the established church due to his literary genius and mastery of the business of mass communication.
And not to put too fine a point on it, but, just want people to be thinking about, sudden new access to a vast amount of information.
Changing the way people conceive of themselves
and their relationship to power structures.
The relationship to other people, like changing their consensus on understanding of reality.
Yes. Interesting. So, over the next few years, Luther engages in essentially a flame war with various representatives from Rome. He publishes at an insane pace for the time, everything from responses to detractors, further arguments against church doctrine, commentary on the Bible, and tracts expanding the tenets of his new understanding of the Christian faith. And as he's writing them, as Matt says, the capacity of the printing industry is exploding around him, and Luther became the most published author of his time. Not only that, but Luther directly supervised the technical production of his printed works, helping merge innovative design flourishes from the Wittenberg artists like Lucas Cranach, which made his works instantly visually recognizable, while managing production schedules and divisions of editions between publishers to maximize the impact of his release schedule and anticipate the desires of his audience. He was building a religion. He was making a brand.
Indeed.
A genuine superstar of a new information age. And perhaps one of the first people we could recognizably call a celebrity in their own time.
There are extant pictures of Luther that were sent by him as gifts to admirers that he has signed at the request of the person, meaning he was giving out autographs.
He was giving out autographs, giving out headshots. We were actually talking about this last night of who could the first celebrity be, and it was pointed out that maybe Caesar was on coins or something, but you couldn't read his words. Right. You couldn't know his own mind.
Yeah, like that. A celebrity is like a new category, like an intermediate sort of figure, below the demigods of like traditional power.
You could have a parasocial relationship with Martin Luther.
Indeed.
So obviously the Pope can't let this stand. And in 1520, Pope Leo X issues a papal bull threatening excommunication unless Luther recanted his beliefs. In 1521, Luther is brought to the Diet of Worms.
Diet of Worms, no thanks.
A meeting of the estates of the Holy Roman Empire under Emperor Charles V, who we will get to next episode, to account for his heresies. After a tense trial, Luther steadfastly refuses to recant and is declared an outlaw by the emperor. Matt, you want to give the famous line he supposedly says to Charles, refusing to relinquish his beliefs?
Here I stand. I can do no other.
Pimp, Chad. Awesome. When we get into who exactly Charles V is next week, the sheer balls of that statement will be even clearer. But before Luther can be taken into custody, Frederick the Wise of Saxony, the elector of Luther's region, organizes a fake kidnapping and spirits Luther away to seclusion in the Wartburg Castle. While in luxurious custody, Luther is corresponding with his allies among the clergy and the estates. He wrote more pamphlets. He began his work of translating, for the first time, the Bible into vernacular German so that the common people could finally encounter the Word.
Now, Frederick the Wise is one of the most enigmatic characters of the entire Reformation. Once Luther had been excommunicated and placed under papal and imperial interdict, Frederick could have arrested Luther at any point.
I believe the nature of that law was basically like it was legal to just kill Luther.
You could legally kill Luther.
Anybody in the empire.
But nobody in Saxony could kill Luther without facing the wrath of the elector, which was his choice. But it wasn't seemingly due to any real theological agreement with Luther. The pride of Wittenberg Cathedral, which was Frederick's project, was his collection of 19,000 holy relics, which included a vial of the breast milk of Mary and a twig from the burning bush. And officially, if you were to take a pilgrimage to see these objects, you would be granted a collective 1.9 million days of relief from purgatory.
I just want to really highlight that detail as an illustration of like how hilariously prescribed and formulaic and just like unsentimental the indulgence trade was. You see the 19,000 relics, you get 1.9 million days off relief from purgatory. Like, how is a day even measured in the eternal hellfire of purgatory? You know, you're floating in this like post-life void of spiritual fire while the Heavenly Father, Lord God, creator of all reality, purifies your soul to receive his grace. And you're just like looking at your watch thinking, damn, glad I saw that breast milk. It could have been 1.9 million in 1 days. So it's no wonder that this whole scheme was so alienating to people.
Well, it is. Purgatory is an attempt to fill in a gap created by the newly urbanized social order. It's like people are asking questions they didn't have time to ask before, and you got to have answers. And over time, it just becomes less convincing. People still have too much time on their hands.
Yes.
And when they start writing to each other, too much ability to compare notes.
Yes, exactly. You know, I don't want to go too deep on this note, but I think it helps see these people in a more, a slightly more sympathetic perspective, because it's easy to think like, oh, these illiterate medieval mud farming peasants like venerating these obviously fake relics. Oh yeah, sure, that's a twig from the fucking burning bush. Somebody kept that in their pocket for 2,000 years. But I do think that the wild receptiveness among the public to Luther's critique of indulgences shows that, yes, these people knew this was bullshit. Mm-hmm. Even when they're deeply held Christian convictions, they knew they were getting scammed, which I think is a relatively eternal feeling among humans. Knowing society is screwing you in some way, even if you're just waiting for someone to come along with the right way to describe it to you.
Yeah. I mean, they honestly, a lot of them could have seen indulgence as more of like having to buy Girl Scout cookies from like their coworker's kid. Like, oh, I got to do this again?
Yes.
Fuck off. Someone comes along and says, and this was actually a big thing for the burghers. Someone comes along and says, hey, you can have a cheaper church. Mm-hmm. And they're like, ding, 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 I'm listening. So Frederick never publicly broke with Catholicism is the weird thing. Mm-hmm. He may not even have ever met Luther in person, but he steadfastly refused every demand by pontiff or emperor to suppress Luther or his writings, and took the extraordinary step of having Luther kidnapped off the road from Worms to prevent his assassination. Now, why he did this is not really well understood. He never wrote it down, but part of the explanation may rest with Frederick's desire to see his domain of electoral Saxony, which was a far eastern backwater when it was split from the richer and more urbanized Duchy of Saxony, became a headquarters of humanist scholarship and to promote the atmosphere of free inquiry that scholarship required.
And you know what? He's known as Frederick the Wise today. So you know what? He got the brand.
Like, you can really see the Reformation in part as the result of a stature-building contest between two branches of the Witten dynasty, the Albertine and the Ernestine,
right?
Who had inherited Saxony after their ancestor had split it up between the two sons, which is a peculiar form of primogeniture that only occurs in this specific part of Europe.
During this time.
Yeah.
And we will get to how insane that makes everything.
So what happened is that two sons inherited the Saxony. One got to choose how it was divided, and then the other one got to pick which one they got.
The classic serving a birthday cake method.
Yep. And so while you have the duchy being much richer and more urbanized, the electoral title is held as essentially a consolation prize in the more remote part. But that rivalry, that his desire to not be a backwater and to fund a church or to fund a university and to try to
popular writer and thinker located there.
And then to have this incredibly profitable printing industry emerge and this renaissance of learning that comes with it and all these students coming flooding the Wittenberg. This is helping him in his competition, his stature of competition as a prince of the Holy Roman Empire.
Right.
And that is a key component of understanding the Reformation as such.
Yes. Because again, literally anybody could have murdered Martin Luther at any given time if it wasn't for Freddie the Wise.
And it's clearly not because he was hit by a bolt from the blue, but from God's will.
Yes.
So while holed up at the Wartburg Castle, Luther corresponded with leaders of his nascent movement and his colleagues back at Wittenberg while commencing work on the first translation of the Bible into German, part of a project, as we said, to make the Word of God accessible to the masses, by creating what he called a priesthood of all believers. Meanwhile, throughout the German lands, Luther's message created a groundswell of popular enthusiasm among the literate population of the towns that saw communities begin to organize their own local churches in defiance of the demands of Rome.
So there's this period from 1517 to 1525 where Luther's Reformation is spreading relatively unchallenged in Central Europe. I mean, yes, he had been branded a heretic and an outlaw, and it was technically legal to kill him on sight, but he had the protection of powerful princes like Frederick. Luther's message had a hyper-receptive audience, and as a bonus actually appealed to the aristocratic elites looking to assert independence from the Pope and the Holy Roman Empire. But in 1525, we see the first widespread movement of the Reformation getting out of Luther's control, as hundreds of thousands of peasants, inspired by Luther's ideas, now being taken increasingly in radical anti-authoritarian directions by new preachers, like guys like Thomas Munster, rose up in violent opposition to their feudal lords.
Now, we've been discussing Luther's criticism of the church in theological terms, but since the church was perhaps the single institution most vital to the maintenance of the feudal order, Luther's movement immediately developed profound political implications. Each class within the empire processed these implications differently depending on their material position and interests. The imperial princes, most notably Philip, Landgrave of Hesse.
I love Landgrave as a title.
The Landgraves and the Margraves are my favorite ones, obviously.
Yes.
Warm and comfortable in their castles, saw in Luther's challenge an opportunity to wrest from the church the tithes and indulgence monies that flowed out of their territories, and also to undermine the emperor's authority as defender of the papacy. The merchants and guild leaders of the towns, less idle than their aristocratic betters, but still dependent upon the expropriation of peasant surpluses, imagined drastically reducing the costs of the church, while also claiming for themselves the church's social authority. In the countryside, the peasants, groaning under the weight of accumulated centuries of feudal taxes and dues, as well as new innovations, such as the enclosure of common land, suffering from a punishing cycle of poor harvest and famines, the most recent of which lasted from 1515 to 1519.
Curious that there's a famine right when this whole thing takes off.
It is very weird how that happens. Saw something altogether more radical in Luther's call to empower the laity. If the church was not necessary to secure the salvation of the soul, then the rule of the princes and nobles that supported the church was just as superfluous. If a community could tend to their spiritual needs collectively without a hierarchy to mediate, it could do the same with their material needs. The fires of peasant rebellion were kindled by a number of radical itinerant preachers, some former clergy like Luther, some enthusiastic laymen, who traveled throughout the lands preaching a vision of collective action that would sweep away the feudal and religious structures of corruption and bring about the founding, finally and for good, of God's kingdom on earth. Rather than wait for a spurious reward in the hereafter, these preachers insisted that the common peasants of Germany possess the power to find their reward in the here and now, in the struggle to build a true Christendom, where the labors and rewards of existence would be shared equally. The most influential and energetic of these preachers was a former priest and early follower of Luther named Thomas Müntzer. Müntzer spent the years before 1525 agitating crowds towards a violent confrontation with godless secular authority, in town after town, in sermons and pamphlets, often one step ahead of the jailer. In the imperial city of Mullenhausen, Müntzer published a piece saying, "All the world must suffer a big jolt. There will be such a game that the ungodly will be thrown off their seats and the downtrodden will rise."
That's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
You can get in big trouble saying that kind of stuff to people.
Seriously. Müntzer spent this time in written argument with Luther and his Wittenberg confederates, who refused to endorse his radical extension of the logic of reform. Luther responded by challenging Müntzer to a public debate.
Debate me, bro.
But Müntzer, who referred to Luther as that easy-living flesh of Wittenberg, had more vital priorities.
These guys, the prose that these guys sling at each other is so good.
It's just annihilate. It's just the best insults of all time.
Yes. So in 1525, peasant bands throughout southern Germany began communally resisting the authority of their alleged overlords. It began with mass refusal to remit taxes, but soon enough spread into a series of interlocking armed revolts that involved tens of thousands of peasants. Led in many cases by disaffected imperial knights with military experience. Hey, you got all these vets sitting around with nothing to do.
And who had their feudal prerogatives clipped by the empire and the princes.
These disaffected knights from the Swiss Alps to the eastern border of the empire. They burned castles and monasteries. They destroyed feudal contracts. And while doing so, they promulgated a political project based on the abolition of unjust taxation and the end of enclosure of common lands and equal justice before the law. The most important expression of this project was the 12 Articles, which, like most of the peasant proclamations, was actually composed by literate townspeople allied with the movements. Amidst calls for economic justice were demands for the rights of communities to choose their own pastors. All the demands were shot through with approving references to Luther's critique of the old order. The third article of the 12 Articles began, "It has until now been the custom for the lords to own us as their property. This is deplorable, for Christ redeemed and bought us all with his precious blood, the lowliest shepherd as well as the greatest Lord, with no exceptions. Thus the Bible proves that we are free and want to be free." The princes of the empire were slow to respond, but eventually began marshaling their own mercenary armies to combat the peasants. While the princes tried to put out the fires by agreeing to peasant demands temporarily while using periods of truce to gather forces to land a death blow, Luther watched from Wittenberg in horror.
The beneficiary of the Saxon elector's protection and patronage, and had been gifted the use of the monastery he lived in as a monk. But still, Luther had nothing but contempt for most secular princes, who he called, quote, generally the biggest fools or the worst scoundrels on earth. But he considered them necessary to uphold the system of laws that kept people from succumbing to their basest sinful instincts, such as failing to share their crop yields with hungry churchmen. Any political order that gave him the freedom to ponder the great questions of faith in comfort and security instead of tiring himself out behind a plow had to have been righteously ordained by God. For Luther, the only way that people could live in Christian peace was under the watchful gaze of godly overlordship. While the peasant forces lost cohesion and purpose due to their inability to coordinate their activities over distance or operate from a unified command structure, and the princely armies began disarming and massacring them in detail, Luther wrote a book meant to resolve any ambiguities that may have been perceived about his stance on the legitimacy of rebellion against the state, as opposed to rebellion against Rome.
Totally different.
Shortly after the climactic Battle of Frankenhausen, which saw the troops of Philip of Hesse and Frederick the Wise butcher over 5,000 peasants and execute Thomas Müntzer after torturing him for days, against the robbing, murderous hordes of peasants hit booksellers' shelves. Of the peasants, Luther wrote, they must be knocked to pieces, strangled and stabbed, covertly and overtly, by everyone who can, just as one must kill a mad dog. Therefore, dear sirs, help here, save here, stab, knock, strangle them, everyone who can, and should you lose your life, bless you, no better death can you ever attain.
God damn, man.
Any loss of respect that Luther suffered in the eyes of the common people of the Holy Roman Empire, which was considerable, he was pelted with rocks in the town of Orlamunda, was more than compensated for by the respect Luther gained in the eyes of the empire's noble class. Luther really never recovers from this totally. His personal influence in the Reformation movement can be said to distinctly begin to drop at around this point. Other people, more in vernacular leaders in different parts, start to take up a local influence because his authority has been undermined by his public siding with the nobility.
Right.
But he does gain that legitimacy.
Hey, it's nice to have powerful friends.
Right. The peasantry, divided by geography and customs, intermittently illiterate, had shown themselves incapable of seriously challenging for power, leaving the princes and nobles free to shape the Reformation as they saw fit. They would build a church inspired by Luther that carried within it an instinctive hostility to the common masses of Europe, a hostility that would go on to shape the secular liberalism that would follow Protestantism. By this point, the Reformation had largely been constrained to the imperial cities, where town councils were able to remake religious order as they saw fit. The electors, landgraves, and dukes of the realm were more circumspect, seeing in Luther both a potential tool to enlarge their power and wealth, but also a potential threat to the stability of their existing power and wealth. The Peasants' War of 1825 helped convince them that there was no longer any containing the popular energy unleashed by Luther's movement, and it was therefore the safest course to ally themselves with Luther in order to direct the energies away from the empire's economic foundations and towards the Antichrist of Rome. For his part, Luther was not overmuch troubled by the betrayed feeling of those who had sympathized with the peasant rebels and thought Luther would support them. In a letter to a friend, he wrote, "He that will not understand, let him not understand. He that will not know, let him be ignorant. It is enough that my conscience pleases God."
It is funny that, like, once you crack open the door of being like, hey, I can actually interpret the Bible.
Yes.
That you're like, well, all the things that immediately benefit me personally, those happen to be the exact words of God.
It's like, wow, as soon as I no longer have to subordinate myself to a social structure and can determine my own relationship to other social objects, I'm always right.
Let me check here in the Bible. Oh, it says that it's good for me to be rich and have powerful friends who protect me, and all the things that undermine that are actually wrong.
This is great. I sure as hell hope that the contradictions of and cognitive dissonance of this spiritual identity don't create a cascade of neuroses that cripples generations coming after me.
Now, let me go write another 30 tracks about how the contradictions and neuroses imposed by the other order are actually demons sent from hell.
Yes.
Anyway, as Luther's forging these positions, allying himself with these princely interests, the Reformation continues to find its key audiences in urban denizens. These wealthier, more literate audiences would have plenty of reasons to be attracted to Luther's ideas. Church exemptions from city taxes, the large amounts of real estate that could be reclaimed from church offices, regaining control over local schools and other institutions from Roman influences. Even indulgences themselves had created mercantile problems. They had to be paid in actual coin, resulting in huge amounts of precious specie bleeding out of German lands and into Italy. Like, literally, your physical gold just being sent away to pay for these.
It's fucking up your
tickets.
trade balance.
Yes.
It's no good, folks. I can't have it.
It's bad for business. And there's also the value of asserting power of the free imperial cities and lesser princely estates against the emperor, who is the defender of the Catholic faith, and who until 1508 had to be crowned by the Pope himself. But this was tough business. There was a constant tension between just how far cities and princes could go in permitting the growth of the Reformation before risking actual conflict with imperial power. And just as this urban population was building the faith, they were building the industry around it, printing. We can see the building of this industry and audience in raw numbers. From 1500 to 1516, Wittenberg printers produced just 123 books, about 8 a year, mostly church tracts and documents for the university, as I mentioned before. Essentially a boutique academic operation. You know how most universities have university presses now? It's like that was basically all of it. After the 95 Theses from 1517 to Luther's death in 1546, Wittenberg printers churned out 2,721 works, more than 90 a year, probably more than 3 million individual copies, about a third of these Luther's own works. And that's just Wittenberg. Major printing industries grew in most major German cities, boutique presses in smaller cities, even portable presses to travel around with princes on military campaigns to spread the word of their victories, each exploding with a similar growth in output. By the mid-16th century, the pace of publishing is enough to sustain regular broadsheets relating current events, early newspapers. The print revolution is changing in fundamental ways how the literate population relates to society and to each other, literally changing people's minds, not in the sense of like their opinions, though it's doing that as well, but how they conceive of themselves in society at a foundational level.
Luther's agonized, racing mind had been unsatisfied with the ritual symbols of faith represented by a compromised and earthly church. He replaced them with a set of symbols that couldn't be alienated by any worldly institution. Biblical scripture.
Literally the word.
Reading the Bible, thinking about the Bible, speaking and writing to others about what the Bible meant. These were the new sacraments of Christian faith. A ceaseless mental regimen that worked through the contradictions of living simultaneously as free beings and as subjects to an all-powerful eternal sovereign. This new kind of faith was deeply intuitive to a burgeoning urban population, living lives that moved at a much faster pace and were much more mediated by alienated market institutions than their peasant cousins. Luther presented them with the Christianity of the hearth, contained in the pages of a book on a shelf, portable and malleable, as was necessary for those who sought to survive the competitive pressures of trucking and bartering in a desacralized environment defined by interactions with strangers or with friends that the demands of business require to be treated as strangers. These evangelical converts could resacralize public space through membership in a community of literate believers who shared the same mental landscape provided by Luther's writings and the writings of his supporters. The Luther publishing boom not only simulated the accumulation and circulation of capital in German cities, all that money that used to flow into Vatican coffers to buy indulgences was now going to local printers and booksellers who used it to increase their capacity and to hire workers. It also created a spiritual environment fit to conduct business in.
So while Luther's building his princely aligned new church up in Wittenberg, others are pushing this Reformation thing even further. The towns of Switzerland were nominally part of the Holy Roman Empire, but had achieved functional independence for generations. First in Zurich, under the leadership of Ulrich Zwingli, then in Geneva under John Calvin, very important guy, Swiss free cities led the way for pushing Luther's concepts to what they considered their logical conclusion, but which Luther and his allies saw as dangerous heresy. Again, it's funny. It's like, I
already did it. You just have to read it and go like, oh, you're right.
Yes.
You're still thinking?
Why are you? I've done the thinking.
You're thinking the way I'm thinking? Your brain's doing the same thing to my stuff that I did to the other stuff? No, you can't do that. That's not allowed.
Zwingli died in battle before Zurich really put itself on the map as a site of theological innovation, but Geneva was a different story. Geneva had successfully negotiated independence from the Duke of Savoy and operated as an independent republic at the time, a prosperous merchant city primed for Protestant innovation. The city's position as a merchant city at the crossroads of Germany and the increasingly Protestant southern France allowed Calvin, another preacher of seemingly limitless energy and eloquence, to emerge as the main rival to Luther's claim of spiritual authority. Turns out, much to Luther's irritation, that a priesthood of all believers, absent the guiding hand of a church hierarchy or a king of the church who literally wore a crown and said what was right and what wasn't, won't all come to the same conclusions.
Oh!
Yes.
Now, Luther didn't start off his project with the intention of destroying Christendom. At first, he assumed, adorably, that his undisputedly correct interpretation of Scripture would inevitably lead to church reform.
He's got the args.
He's got the args, folks.
People see the args, and they will come to the right conclusion.
He will win the debates, and then they will be forced by the logic of his argument to concede to him. Because they want to go to heaven? Doesn't everybody want to go to heaven?
Yes.
So Luther's reform movement would be the triumphant capstone of a series of reform movements that had been fixtures of the church since its foundation. But his excommunication and the repression of his followers, wherever allies of Rome were in power, disabused him of any hope of changing the church that way. It would have to be destroyed, root and branch, because if these people would not see the light of God, it meant that they must, by definition, be under the spell of Satan.
Right.
It's the only way to explain their failure to come to the same conclusions as him.
When you only have two choices, God or Satan, it's got to be one or the other.
These are the correct arguments, and you still don't agree with me. I'm afraid you have tested positive for the devil. So that meant that the church went from being this institution that he was hoping to reform to one that had to be destroyed and replaced.
Right.
And this destruction must be waged by the people, and the only people who could wage a war of destruction against the church were the princes of the empire,
Right.
people like Frederick the Wise and Philip of Hesse, who had access to vast state revenues, who had the power and authority to dispense justice, raise armies, and go to war. As secular rulers began reforming the church in their own domains, Lutheranism as a practice began to take shape. It meant a church that maintained many of the hierarchical structures of Catholicism, only administered by the secular states rather than by the Vatican. Princes would appoint preachers and fund the primary schools necessary to spread the literacy scriptural appreciation demanded. Luther had condemned 5 of the 7 sacraments as unbiblical, but insisted on the validity of infant baptism and the Eucharist, even if the communion wafer may not turn into the body of Christ as the Catholic Church taught. Luther dismissed transubstantiation as baseless superstition, but the ritual of the Eucharist still held for Luther a real presence of Christ.
I just love how much you got to think about this little piece of bread.
Yeah.
It's
when it comes down to is that Luther had a subjective emotional experience with the Eucharist that he could not explain away. And the Reformed critique that said, no, there's nothing here, could not be defeated because it's not in the Bible.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, this new type of religiosity can't express subjective truth.
Well, that's the conflict that rages at the heart of him, is that he's all about the args, he's all about the by your logic, but in the end he feels something. But
exactly.
I feel it's there, so it has to be, and he cannot argue himself away.
It's a career of invective. Like, he's screaming his lungs out for his entire career as a writer, and he's incredibly bilious and combative. And it's because he's trying to hammer everything into people's minds. He's trying to hammer his whole heart and soul onto the page, but there is always a latency and a loss of resolution through translation.
Right.
And by the time it becomes mere text, as powerful as it is, it's going to become denatured, and new people looking at it are not going to engage with the ideas the same way. And so the question of the Eucharist becomes this incredibly important one, because so much unspoken emotion rests at the heart of it.
Right.
The remaining sacraments that Luther held to were meant to connect believers to the institutions of this new Protestant church.
Right.
So the institutions that Luther and the secular authorities who rallied to Luther's banner in the decades after the Diet of Worms saw as the only bulwark against Catholic power, who they saw in increasingly demonic and apocalyptic terms.
So in the independent Swiss cities, away from the power politics of the empire itself, townspeople and preachers like Zwingli and Calvin felt free to push beyond Luther's self-imposed boundaries. They noticed that the Eucharist had no more scriptural basis than any of the other sacraments, that Luther himself was busy writing this invective to condemn. So Landgrave Philip of Hesse, that doltish enthusiast of the early Protestantism, attempted to heal the breach between Luther and Zwingli on the question of the Eucharist before it could permanently divide the evangelical movement. At the Colloquy of Marburg, I love the names for everything.
We love them, don't we?
A colloquy. When was the last time we had a good colloquy?
We have not had a colloquy in centuries.
Let's get a colloquy together after this.
Let's do it, guys.
All right. In 1529, Luther and Zwingli carried out a grueling debate on the metaphorical and literal content of the scriptural phrase, "This is my body." On the first day of the debate, Zwingli, frustrated with Luther's stubbornness, asked, "Should then everything go according to your will?" Even though he had every incentive to accommodate those who saw the Eucharist as purely metaphorical in the interest of maintaining unity, Luther could not agree. He was, in his words, shackled. "I cannot escape. The word is too strong." And this goes back to what we were just saying. Yeah. It's like, you can feel Luther, despite his eloquence, despite his argument, you can feel him struggling with the page, with the word, with his own brain, to be like, why can't I make you see what is inside my soul?
He is running against the limitations of language as a communication of truth. And
shackled. I cannot escape.
And he is stuck he's in this tragic relationship where he can never reflect on it and disengage from it, because it destroys him over time. Not only did the Swiss fanatics, as Luther called them, adhere to a strictly literal Eucharist, they also asserted that clergy appointments and church governments were the business of the church members themselves. And while Luther was content to live the contradiction between free will and God's will, Calvin insisted on living instead with the full implications of predestination. a doctrine that had been promulgated by St. Augustine, but largely ignored by theologians until Luther. An all-powerful God knows who will be saved and who will be damned. No human act, from prayer to charity, can sway that decision. That might sound like a bummer, but it was a doctrine perfectly suited to the realities of urban power politics. In Geneva, Calvin brought together an alliance of leading citizens to exercise secular power while also dominating the newly formed civil church. Their brand of uncompromising, austere belief, propagated by Calvin's own prolific writings, would be hugely influential in the towns of southern France, the Spanish Netherlands, and the Rhineland.
Which is coincidentally where a huge trade road runs.
Exactly. Very weird. Yes.
Yes. As Luther's Reformation spread and splintered, other sects were becoming even more radical. Calvin may have disparaged the Eucharist, but there was one sacrament everyone understood to be untouchable if you wanted to keep your head on your shoulders. Infant baptism may not have been in the Bible, but it was the ritual that consecrated the relationship between citizens and their sovereigns. It's like the spiritual form of being issued a social security card, basically. You are now a citizen.
You are written into the books.
Yes. So by the 1530s, groups known as the Anabaptists promulgated a faith that bordered on anarchism. They rejected infant baptism, believing that only those who had freely accepted Christ and confessed faith could be baptized. And that faith rejected almost all forms of secular authority. And it sought to build communities wholly outside the realm of established society, sometimes including communal living. And naturally, these groups were seen as insanely radical and dangerous to Catholics and magisterial Lutherans alike, and were violently opposed, persecuted, hunted, and executed wherever they sprung up, including in Switzerland. In Zwingli's Zurich, Anabaptists were punished by being tied up and drowned in a river. A classic case of, okay, you asked for it, bro. This spasm of radical reformation would reach its most dramatic edge in the German city of Münster in the mid-1530s. There, a sect of Anabaptist ministers, with the aid of a wealthy merchant Bernard Knipperdoling,
Hell yeah,
were able to stage a quasi-democratic coup of city government and enforce Anabaptist principles through the secular civic authority. This would include mandatory rebaptism, a wave of iconoclastic destruction of church property, and eventually confiscation of property and declaration that all property was to be held communally.
Now, soon the local archbishop led forces to lay siege to Munster, and the isolated city descended into a frenzy of religious ecstasy as the Anabaptists tried to create heaven on earth in the waning stores of their food reserves. The stories of starvation, forced polygamy, violent persecution of unbelievers from the years-long siege became a cautionary tale for over-enthusiastic reformers after the archbishop's troops breached the city walls and the leading Anabaptists were tortured and executed. Their bodies were hung in gibbets from the walls of St. Lambert's Church. Eventually, the bones were removed, but the cages remain to this day. The Munster Rebellion bloodily confirmed the boundaries of religious innovation that secular authorities of all confessions would allow. Anabaptist sects such as the Mennonites would survive by adhering to a strict policy of political quietism while seeking the sponsorship of sympathetic landowners. Most would eventually migrate to the New World. The New Jerusalem would not be found in Europe.
The fact that the cages are still there on the church in Munster is
just reminding everybody what happens if you fuck up.
This is you can go this far, no further.
Yep.
I really want to see those cages someday.
That would be sick.
By the late 1530s, Luther had suffered at least one heart infraction. His vision failed, his eardrum had ruptured, he had increasing heart pain, general weakness, and fainting. His bowels failed him. In fact, for a guy who loves shit and fart jokes so much, for most of his adult life, Luther was beset by near debilitating constipation.
I think it makes sense. I think that's why he was always thinking of shit, because he hadn't taken one.
Yes, he was wishing for the shit that never came.
Yeah, like there is a story that might be apocryphal that he came to his apotheosis. He came to a religious epiphany around the question of faith.
Mm-hmm.
Because the thing that motivated Luther, the thing that made him believe that like he was giving people good news with his religious innovations was the other side of all of this question of hell and damnation was God's grace.
Yes.
Freely given.
Yes.
And that is the other thing that he tried to communicate in his writing that ended up getting lost, because it was this subjective experience of grace.
Mm-hmm.
And he is said apocryphally to have had it while trying to take a shit.
Well, trying to feel the release.
Yeah, well, trying to feel the release in like a castle turret. We don't know if that's true or not, but it certainly fits with his general lifelong fixation on the anus and on shit.
Well, it's just some choice scatological humor from Martin Luther. On wishing that the Pope would have read his own writings, he said, "Devil, I have shit my pants. Have you smelt it?" And then later, but if that is not enough for you, devil, I have also shit and pissed. Wipe your mouth on that and take a hearty bite.
Yeah.
And of course, his line about the end of his life.
Yeah, like as his health was failing and he was kind of becoming aware of his own mortality, he wrote, "I am a ripe stool and the world is a gigantic anus." And he was just
waiting to be
he's basically
pinched off.
waiting to be pinched off. Yeah.
What a mind.
Yeah, something.
A beautiful mind.
Mm-hmm.
So Luther spends his final years in Wittenberg, nurturing a growing family. He had taken a wife, Katharina, in 1525, corresponding with his associates, solidifying a new church doctrine in Protestant lands, and heaping increasingly dire abuse on his detractors in print. As he wrote to his closest associate, Philip Melanchthon, and incidentally, Philip goes on to lead the church after Luther, but when we're talking about brands here, Martin Luther, clean, simple, rolls off the tongue. Philip Melanchthon.
Well, it's even worse than that because Philip Melanchthon might be the most Simon Pure dork ass nerd in world history. He's up there with like Isaac Newton.
Mm-hmm.
Just a little bookworm dork.
Mm-hmm.
So he is a German theology student who was born Philip Schwarzwald, which is in German black earth. But because of his passion for the word of God, which of course was in Greek, he changed his name to the Greek equivalent of Black Earth, which is Melanchthon. He is a fucking weeb for ancient Greece because it's the language of the Bible. He was a weeb for the Bible. Bible was his manga, basically.
Yes.
But he was one of the biggest dorks of all time. And it's very funny because
Luther's TA.
Yes, and they have a very funny relationship because Martin Luther is this like incredibly charming, personally garrulous Chad,
yes,
wife and kids, just
stories of like, was he'd roll through town, he'd like do a sermon and then head over to the local pub afterwards and just like host everyone at the table and just like ribald conversation.
He was a classic German party animal type guy, and in fact, there is a collection of his of all of his conversations that he had while just like getting shit-faced off of his wife's beer that she brewed.
Yes.
And like eating trenchers of stew. It's called Table Talk. And there's a lot of shit jokes in there.
Yes.
And then Melanchthon is just this weedy little dork who like can't look anybody in the eye.
Yes. I mean, for the amount of work that he did to build the church.
Oh, he was hugely powerful, but he's an example of why Luther is such a singular figure in world history.
Yeah.
Because you can't imagine Melanchthon holding this on his shoulders the way Luther did.
Yeah, it's the reason that it's called Lutheranism and not Melanchthonism, beyond just that it doesn't roll off the tongue.
Yeah.
But anyway, this is what Luther wrote towards the end of his life to Melanchthon. "I was born for this purpose, to fight with the rebels and the devils, and to lead the charge. Therefore, my books are very stormy and warlike. I have to uproot trunks and stumps, hack at the thorns and hedges, and fill the potholes. So I am the crude woodsman who has to clear and make the path. But Master Philip comes after me, meticulously and quietly, builds and plants, widows and waters happily, according to the talents God has richly given him."
He's an indoor kid. God love him.
Luther's debilitating pamphlet writing addiction was contagious. An army of imitators, both lay people and clergy, rushed to add their own contributions to the torrent of ink spilled in the course of building reformed religious institutions. Among them were some of the most powerful princes of the empire. In 1541, Frederick the Wise's successor, John Frederick of Electoral Saxony, engaged in a war of words with his fervently Catholic Wettin cousin from Ducal Saxony, we talked about this earlier, Heinrich IV. At one point in this literary duel, Duke Heinrich published a pamphlet responding to John Frederick called, this is the name of the pamphlet, "Well-grounded, steadfast, grave, true, godly, Christian, nobly inclined duplique against the Elector of Saxony's second defamatory, baseless, fickle, fabricated, ungodly, unchristian, drunken, God-detested treatise." That's the name of the work. John Frederick fired back with, his response was titled, "True, steadfast, well-grounded, Christian, and sincere reply to the shameless, Calphurnic book of infamy and lies by the godless, accursed, execrable defamer, evil-working Barabbas, also whore-addicted Hulfernus of Branchenweg, who calls himself Duke Heinrich the Younger.
Go off.
Calpurnic.
Yeah, this is basically this is a rap battle.
It's a
this is an actual rap battle of history. This is what those really look like.
Imagine somebody comes up to you and calls you a horror-addicted Holofernes.
It's go time.
Yes, gloves are off. One subject of bitter argument was whether Martin Luther had ever referred to the corpulent elector as John Sausage. No matter how rich and powerful you are, no one can resist the lure of a good public flame war, and it reminds you why billionaires are on Twitter.
They can't get it. It's like you see everybody doing this,
and you got to get in on it.
You got to get in on it.
Everybody's having fun posting.
Everybody's
memes.
having so much fun posting.
Why can't I do it as well?
Yeah, it's a whole new fun thing to do. Like, what else are you doing? Like sitting on your throne, trying to ignore your hemorrhoids while like eating another fucking turkey leg.
So I encourage everyone to get online and post to Elon Musk that he's an evil working Barabbas.
Yeah.
The 1540s also see Luther direct invective at the Islamic Turks, perhaps more understandable as their armies encroached ever more over Christian lands of southern Europe, and against the Jews. The Screed against the Jews was a relatively minor work in Luther's time, but as one might expect, it was appropriated to much higher significance during certain periods in future German history.
Luther's views on Jews change over the course of his career as a reformer. In his early days, he writes approvingly of Jews and sympathetically of Jews, claiming that the reason that they have to this point not reconciled themselves to Christ is that they were alienated by the awful, corrupt institutions of the Catholic Church.
Which would seem reasonable.
And that now that the new scriptural biblical church had emerged, they could see the light. But later in his career, after that didn't happen, and they all said, no thanks, we'll stay with our community and traditions and everything, he said, well, then fine, fuck you. You deserve every calumny, every given to you, and that you should essentially... there is a genocidal implication in his work there at the end, just like if you refuse to acknowledge Christ, you are not reconcilable to Christendom. Again, as he conceived.
Classic, like I've given you the args.
Exactly.
What are you
doing? Same thing, like the church, the Jews, and the Turk had to be destroyed to create a truly apocalyptic horizon.
On a rare trip to his birthplace in Eisleben, Martin Luther fell suddenly, mortally ill, and died in February 1546 at age 62. In 30 years, he had almost single-handedly shattered the unity of the Christian church, something that would have been unimaginable at the time of his birth. He had worked tirelessly to build a whole new confession of Christian faith, one born out of Scripture alone, accessible to the common man, free from the indecent mediating of some princely pope. His work had redrawn the map of secular power along lines of faith. Protestantism would be the common cause and motivation for alliances among northern German princes and in Bohemia to the east. Protestantism would soon be the ruling religion of Scandinavia and Denmark and the Netherlands, and after Henry VIII got too horny to obey the Pope anymore, England. While Catholicism would be protected by the Habsburgs in their lands of the southern Holy Roman Empire, in Austria and in Spain, as well as in the stalwartly Catholic France and, of course, Italy. These divisions would be the battle lines for nearly a century of religious violence, and eventually, the 30 Years' War.
Luther had sought to convert Christendom into a continental fellowship of believers, all reading from the same hymnal. By the time he died, the Holy Roman Empire was on the verge of war as rival Catholic and Lutheran power centers marshaled forces to crush each other, while Calvinist heresy spread throughout the cities of Western Europe. Without the disciplining structure of a universal church, universal religious truth broke down, leaving instead a patchwork of churches tied to local regimes of power vying for control of territories and souls in Northern Europe, while the Pope and his infernal minions in Spain, Italy, and southern Germany gathered their powers for a counterstrike. It was certainly not what Luther had wanted when he set out his great project of reformation, but Luther died nonetheless content that it was all God's will. If the people refused to heed his message, it was because they were not worthy of it. They would have to be tested and purified, as he himself had been. Having given himself over to God's grace, Luther believed that no action he took in God's name could have been wrong. Now, there's no evidence that he actually told Charles V at Worms, "Here I stand, I can do no other," but there's a reason that line has for centuries stood as Luther's epitaph.
In October 1617, all across Germany, a massive jubilee was held to celebrate the centenary of Martin Luther's monumental act of defiance against the church. 100 years of Protestantism. Special sermons were preached, plays commemorating the important events in Luther's life, choirs of children sang newly composed songs, new broadsheets printed and posted commemorating the event, souvenir medals were struck and handed out to participants, a genuine festival of confessional solidarity that established Luther's posting of the 95 Theses as the foundational event of the Reformation.
It's important to remember, the event that we begin this episode with, the hammering of the Theses, was, for this first 100 years, considered one event among several that were the founding events of the Reformation.
Right.
It was the creation of this specific pageantry around this anniversary, as we'll say, as a political project that gave that the historic truth to Luther's posting of the Theses as the beginning of it.
It is manufacturing history,
Yes.
of which we are still retelling in the same way. But hey, it's a dramatic moment. He's got a hammer, a nail, it's a broadsheet, it is striking it in the door.
The thing is, because this was an event of pageantry, they understood you got to pick an event that's going to give him a little zhuzh.
Yes.
And you can't beat a guy striding out there and hammering something into a damn door.
This was not an organically developed event. It was the plan of Frederick V, Elector of the Palatinate, himself a fierce Calvinist, designed to promote unity between all Protestants in the Holy Roman Empire and strengthen his anti-Catholic political alliance.
Yeah, the whole thing was funded by the Palatinate.
Yes.
As a state, as a soft power project, basically.
He was the golden voice of the 17th century.
Yes.
It was projected as a moment of peace and accomplishment, the triumph of the Reformation in establishing itself in stable opposition to the evil papist authority. But remember the name Frederick V, because within 1 year of the Jubilee, his fanatical devotion to these Reformation principles will drag all of Europe into 30 years of hell on earth.
Boom.
This first episode of Hell on Earth is free and public for all listeners. All subsequent episodes will be exclusively for Patreon subscribers to Chapo Trap House. To subscribe today for the rest of the series, as well as all of Chapo's premium content, go to patreon.com/Chapo Trap House. Hell on Earth is written by Matt Christman and Chris Wade, with additional contributions in this episode by Michael Coase. It's produced by me, Chris Wade, with editing from our co-producer Nick Quaz. Show art and animation is from the great Ben Clarkson, and you can find a supplemental interactive atlas for the series by John White over at hellonearth.chapotraphouse.com. Our theme music is by Nick Diamonds, with additional music by Alessandro Takeshi, John Aarons, Austin Riley, Tyrant King, Blackout Princess, and Stale Cooper. Join us next week for the Black Death, the Universal Monarch, and what the hell is the Holy Roman Empire anyway? It's 1348, and Europe is dying. In just 4 years in the mid-1300s, as much as 50% of Europe's population died of bubonic plague. Between now and the next presidential election, imagine half of everyone you know dying. If you're sitting in a room with your significant other or parent or child, friend, neighbor, coworker, they're dead. Picture the social devastation, the breakdown in civil society, the disruption of any reliable infrastructure and simple rhythms of life. This was the Black Death. And though this apocalyptic pandemic took place nearly 3 centuries before the main focus of our story, the 30 Years' War, it is the necessary backdrop for the general crisis of the 17th century. The Black Death was a plague that took the lives of as many as 200 million people in Eurasia. But it was also a fatal infection in the very structure of feudal society. And as the body of feudalism slowly began to die and decay, a new order was struggling to be born out of it.
The Black Death left the existing structures of political, economic, and religious authority in Europe intact, but fundamentally eroded their ability to sustain themselves in the new environment created by the plague itself. Cycles of disease unleashed by the plague would continue into the early modern era. Climatic conditions would deteriorate, undermining the agricultural basis of the economy. Above all, the classes that had been forged by the medieval period, nobles and burghers and peasants, would all struggle for control of the rapidly shifting conditions of life. This struggle would see the rise of a number of powerful dynasties that knit together large domains through conquest and strategic marriage. The conflict between these continental powers built state capacity that would have been inconceivable before the Black Death. Eventually, this process would culminate in one particular dynastic ruler bringing Europe to fear and trembling at the prospect of submission to a single ruler, a universal monarch.
And through all this death, new instruments of state building and finance will slowly emerge from the destruction. Institutions that will serve as the infant origins for state capitalism centuries on. The German banking family, the Fuggers, appear here, and through their financing of the dynastic wars of this era, will allow its members to become some of the richest men the world has ever seen, personally accumulating nearly 2% of Europe's entire GDP. It's not long after the Black Death that the first recorded mention of the Fugger family appears. A terse record with the original Germanic spelling of their name, of the family patriarch resettling in Augsburg. It reads simply, in what could be the title of this entire series, Fucker has arrived. So feudalism. I guess it would be best to start with a working definition of the system we're going to kill. To try to be as broad and simple as possible, feudalism structured society around contractual relationships based on landholding. Land was granted by a hereditary aristocracy in exchange for obligations of military service or returns of food and goods, subdividing down to a local manor lord who controlled the actual lands worked by the peasants. Peasants were bound to the land and worked on it in exchange for protection by their local lords. All of society was bound by this system of obligations, allowing a relatively small group of nobles to accumulate vast wealth off the exploitation of primitive cultivation employed by the peasants. I mean, I feel like just through pop culture, we've all got a working understanding of feudalism, but what's actually important here? The peasants were fucked, constantly burdened by heavy tithes and taxes put on them, and the system of land distribution and military obligation bound the aristocracy together. I think it's partly difficult to convey this because it is an alien system to us, the free market system that is so deeply ingrained in us that it's difficult to conceive of a system that's not based off of profit and surplus value. What do you think, Matt?
Well, the most vital fact of feudalism is that it is a collection of hierarchically arranged bilateral contractual relationships based on land tenure, and mostly the recognition of the states on the ground. Whoever has the power in a given area, sort of by definition, has been given consent to govern it.
Right.
And feudalism is just an arrangement of hierarchical concessions to reality that are all facilitated by an upward flow of tribute and a downward flow of military protection.
Right.
And it is labor exchanged for security up and down this chain of social power.
Right.
Classic feudalism, as we imagined it, was already in a deep crisis when the Black Death hit. The archetypal feudal subject was the serf, bound to the land and bound to provide some percentage of his surplus agricultural product to a lord who promised military protection. Serfdom arose after the collapse of the Roman slave economy as a way to manage a situation of cheap, abundant farmland with not enough people to farm it. Those military aristocratic families who possessed the ability to dominate the peasantry found compulsory servitude to be the only viable method of compelling the food production they depended on. Thanks in part to a prolonged era of higher temperatures known as the medieval warm period that began in the 10th century, which increased crop yields, Europe's population exploded in this time. By the eve of the Black Death, the situation of cheap land and expensive labor had been reversed. Land was increasingly expensive and hands to till it were easy to come by. Feudal obligations were giving way to formal titles of land rent and cash payments for laborers. Slash and burn agricultural practices had also depleted the fertility of much of the continent's soil, leading people to cut down swaths of forest and attempt to scratch calories out of marginal lands that had never been cultivated before. The situation was ripe for the liquefaction of the rural economy and a move to cities, but at this same moment, Europe was suffering from a crippling shortage of the precious metals that served as the only stable medium of exchange and storehouse of value. Existing sources in Europe, exploitable by existing methods, were running out, and the end of the crusading project in the Mideast had extinguished any hope of gaining more by conquest in that direction. Without metal currency, it was impossible for anyone to convert agricultural surpluses into other forms of economic value. The combination of declining food production and rising population was socially combustible, but nowhere, from the burgeoning cities to the rural peasant villages, was there any class capable of challenging the power of the roughly 300 families who together claimed 60% of Europe's land and almost all of its political power. Mm-hmm. This stalemate was only broken by the arrival of 12 Black Sea trading vessels arriving at the port of Messina in Sicily, carrying an unknown and unspeakable cargo. The plague resolved the contradiction of too many mouths with too little land, but by increasing the leverage of the remaining peasants in their constant negotiation with the landowning class who required the surplus of their labor, a host of new contradictions were created.
You mentioned crusading there for a second, and I just wanted to dive into that for a moment because there's a way to think of the Crusades as, yes, this religiously motivated, fanatic movement, but it's also kind of the colonization project of Europe.
It's a project, like most of these projects are, of state formation, of dynastic leaders attempting to utilize the war-making capacity that they did have, the power that they had to command armies, to aggrandize themselves. They had basically fought themselves to a standstill in the grubby little wars over Europe. They had this constant low-level warfare between each other that had ground to a halt. There was nobody securing any real domination anywhere. And the hope of the Middle East was that a colonial and a proto-colonial relationship could be established, and new lands could be folded in, because there's no incentive in feudalism for capital to be reinvested.
Right.
And so that means that when a given sovereign feels that they are in an unstable relationship, they're declining revenues or whatever, their only real recourse is to try to dominate and take over other territory. And the Crusades are really an extension of that outward, as like the social forces, the power projection of European states becomes great enough to get thousands of guys to march into the fucking Syrian desert.
Yes. And if you look into the history of the Crusades, it really backs us up, because they very immediately become not about what they're supposed to be. And like, which one is the one where they like start going to the Holy Land and then just get distracted immediately and just raid Constantinople?
Yeah, the fourth Crusade is one of the most absolutely
petty,
blackly,
cynical.
It's got to be one of the most like blackly comic incidents in world history. It's amazing there hasn't been a movie made about it. Verhoeven could make an amazing movie about the Fourth Crusade. So a bunch of crusaders go to Venice, and they basically promise loot to the Doge Dandalo of Venice and the Venetian Republic, that if they would build them a navy, because they just got there without ships, because they were a bunch of horse lord dumbasses from France and whatnot, and they basically promised them booty when getting to Byzantium, and eventually they owed the Venetians so much that the only way that they could pay them off ended up being to lay siege to and then break into Constantinople, the capital of Eastern Christianity, whose call for help had signaled the First Crusade,
right?
And stripped it of valuables and overthrew its emperor and replaced him with a Latin emperor. And then they all some of them straddled forward, but that was basically it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then I think, you also mentioned that, coincidentally or interestingly, the last true call for a crusade happens like basically the moment before the New World is discovered.
Yes.
And then you get this new thing, and you're like, well, we don't really need to do that anymore. You know? This new place to develop an expansionary state project.
In the very early days, in the days around before and after the Reformation, there is this abortive papal attempt to get one last crusade against the Turks now that they've been kicked out of the Holy Land. And it's actually Spain that kind of undermines it, which is one of the things that led a lot of the French a lot of the French clergy, like the Catholic clergy, to decide that, France is the only real guarantor of Catholicism because Spain won't do this because they're pursuing their own petty interest. But that failed to go here, and instead you get the Reformation and the violence associated with that, and of course the founding of the New World, a new place to express that need to feed the machine of war that defines the relations in Europe.
The old feudal order had resisted the centralized consolidation of power. Yes, there were kings and the heads of those 300 families at the top of the system, but their rule was fractured, contested, realms constantly being split and reformed and subdivided and conquered. The state capacity necessary to sustain a permanent expansionary project just had not developed. This is immediately obvious if you look at any map of political divisions before, say, the 15th century. Little archipelagos of lands and domains stretching over vast territories, broken up by other duchies, ecclesiastical holdings, lands held by foreign rulers in different countries, and innumerable smaller lands held by other titles. We'll get into this more when we focus on the insane mess of the Holy Roman Empire, but anyone who's played Crusader Kings or Europa Universalis knows what I'm talking about. So we have this feudal system that had kind of reached an organizational maximum, but then the cold scythe of Black Death comes along and just eradicates fully half of the people in it. And in the aftermath of that horror, suddenly there's some space to move. And Jesus Christ, did people start moving. Up to 25% of rural settlements were completely abandoned, with the survivors fleeing to nearby cities. These newcomers bumped up against the existing urban guilds and political authorities. The century or so after the Black Death saw spasms of violent conflict running up and down the social scale.
In the countryside, peasants were able to negotiate with their lords for better pay, fewer feudal labor obligations, or if they were tenants on the lord's land, a less burdensome rent. The nobility responded by using their political power to enforce higher taxes on farmers, increased feudal cash obligations, and to enclose the common land that provided a material base for peasant resistance to noble exploitation. The result was an increase in class conflict that would break into cyclical patterns of open violence. Between 1350 and 1500, major peasant revolts had twice rocked France, thrice rocked England, Spain, Denmark, Norway, Transylvania, and the Holy Roman Empire all saw rebellions as well. These armed uprisings were crushed by the combined might of the royal dynasties and the nobility, but such emergencies were generally the only domestic political activity that saw the kings and aristocrats on the same side. Kings sought to consolidate power while the high aristocratic families struggled to maintain absolute authority within their fiefdoms. In Western Europe, the constant military conflict between dynasties had the effect of pulling power towards the center, as the business of warfare suppressed internal class conflict and incentivized kings and their vassals to cooperate in the creation of effective regimes of taxation and military mobilization. This process concentrated authority in kings who monopolized the mechanisms for waging war. In Spain, the Reconquista, the long struggle to retake the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, completed in 1492, produced a powerful Spanish monarchy ruled by the Trastamara family. Trastamara. The same dynamic applied in France, where Valois power was affirmed by the successful completion of the 100-year-long campaign to drive the English back across the Channel. Now, for England, defeat of the dynastic project in France led to a collapse of Plantagenet family legitimacy under the ineffectual King Henry VI and a brutal civil war pitting the branches of the ruling families against each other over control of the burgeoning state. This war between York and Lancaster, later dubbed by Victorian literature the War of the Roses, destroyed the lineages of the great houses of England, allowing the exiled Welsh lord Henry Tudor to claim the throne and impose a strong dynastic state on a decimated aristocracy.
It sounds interesting. Somebody should maybe write a fantasy series about that. Wonder if you just threw some dragons into that.
Perhaps magic of some kind.
Yeah, a little bit of that.
Yeah,
seems like it could be popular.
Zombies?
Now we're talking. If only there was a legendary wall at the northern end of this kingdom.
That would be helpful.
Yeah.
In German lands, however, the high aristocrats were so powerful as to resist participation in dynastic military projects, and the Holy Roman Emperor, who embodied the state, was unable to meaningfully direct it. By the early modern period, the empire was a disempowered medieval throwback surrounded by dynamic centralizing monarchies. So we've got these dynasties in France and Spain that are gaining this territorial power and the ability to project authority, as I said. They have suborned the church in its own way to their aims. You've got, as we said, this tradition of a Gallic Catholic Church that starts really with the Avignon papacy in the Middle Ages, when the French king basically doesn't like the Pope and creates his own Pope that is seated in Avignon.
We've got Pope at home.
Yeah. And they persist there for centuries.
It's a longer than you think. There are two popes
it's
for
a
like
long ass
100
time.
years.
It's a long ass time. And it establishes this French prerogative and control over high ecclesiastical offices. Now, in Spain, that authority is expressed by their control over the Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition is not a papal bureaucracy. It answered to and was established by the Catholic Church. When you look at
the Spanish rulers.
the Spanish
monarchy.
Spanish monarchy. When you look at the persecution campaigns of the Inquisition, yes, you're looking at religious fanaticism. But what you're really looking at is the assertion of a increasingly centralized dynastic authority in the Ferdinand and Isabella regime at the end of the Reconquest.
It's almost, I mean, this might be a little reaching, but it's basically like a early modern state trying to grope towards, I don't know, a police force or something like that. You know, a domestic projection of power, of violence, of force. Yes.
Right. But the thing is that they gain this. Like, you see them gaining power. You see them gaining a capacity. But there is this devil's bargain that they have to strike with local power, because the only way that they can project this exterior force is if they grant autonomy to local leaders. Because if you're fighting a war, you, at this low level of technological sophistication, cannot make anybody really do anything.
Right.
If the nobles don't want to send you taxes and they don't want to send you levies, then you don't get them. Especially if you've got a war to fight, you're not going to be able to fight them too. So you have to grant them control of local authority over the lands in their area. And then, they will send you tribute willingly. They will send you arms and they will support you. But it is at the cost of that assumption. And that's okay for a while. The conflict is latent until the state gets strong enough that in order to get stronger, it must increase the efficiency of the system, which has to come at the expense of local control.
Right.
And that creates a cycle of reaction that is going to power through all of these states as the tensions and violence and instability of the era increase.
I mean, I'm going to say this over and over again in the series, not to put too fine a point on it, but ultimately that is what this whole story is: how to build a state.
How to build a state.
And
how to build, and with it, capitalism.
Yes.
As a political economy, as a social reality. Because the two are necessary. The one is the vessel for the other.
And so we'll see over and over all these little innovations, these new attempts, some failing, some succeeding, to try to put together everything that we understand in the 21st century of what a country is. A state, yes. It's through this period that we see the rise and consolidation of one of the great houses of Europe, the line that will be the focus of the next part of our series. Some of the greatest to ever do it, one of the most prominent families in European history with the jaws to match. Give it up for the Habsburg dynasty.
Air horn.
Starting from a line of minor counts in Switzerland, the Habsburgs, through marriage and strategic alliances, slowly expanded their domains over centuries to the east, gaining dynastic control of Austria in the 13th century and south towards Italy in the 14th. Throughout their rise, the Habsburgs gained from conquest and domination, as well as strategic marriage and inheritance, but also from the sheer luck of outlasting their competition, placing heirs in lines of succession that they could have easily been passed over in, until everyone else fortunately died before them, leaving the Habsburg heirs holding the bag. It's kind of like a game of musical thrones, but instead of waiting for the music to stop, you're just waiting for all your uncles to die. So the line split for a time in the 1300s and 1400s, but in 1452, Frederick III gains the Pope's favor and was crowned Holy Roman Emperor, beginning a centuries-long Habsburg domination of that position. In 1477, Frederick's son Maximilian was married to the Duke of Burgundy's daughter, giving Habsburgs control of the Low Countries, the Netherlands and Flanders. Maximilian's son Philip was married to Joanna of Castile in 1497, giving Habsburg control of Spain with effective control of Naples and southern Italy. And Maximilian was proclaimed Holy Roman Emperor in 1508. Again, if you're a Crusader Kings fan, this is just an insane run of impressive dynastic consolidation.
So dynasties are the forerunners of the modern state. These self-contained, immortal political units with their own mythic origin stories, their own values and collective interests and cultures and means of pursuing goals. The Habsburgs had their own storied family history, complete with ancient documents that showed them to be the direct descendants of the Caesars of Rome. In truth, the family had risen to prominence from minor noble origins thanks to their control of Alpine toll roads. Dynastic wealth was not based on economic productivity, but by ability to extract rent through the monopolization of violence. Thanks to that money, the Habsburgs could afford the cost of having those documents forged and eventually adopt as a symbol the letters AEIOU, which had several meanings, the most important of which was, in Latin, Austria is destined to rule the world. Another saying of the era was more accurate. Let others fight. You, happy Austria, marry. Nothing that the Habsburg family did mattered more to their eventual rise to European preeminence than their robust fertility. When the first Habsburg bought his way onto the throne of the Holy Roman Empire, he solidified Habsburg influence by securing marriages to every secular electoral family. This process of consolidation was eventually embodied in the person of Emperor Maximilian. His marriage to the daughter of the Duke of Burgundy and the subsequent marriages of his children to the Trastamara family of Spain gave Maximilian the chance to affirm the grandeur of his name for all of Europe. Unfortunately, the system that allowed a single man to amass such a massive amount of territorial power didn't select for ability, intelligence, or vision, just familial lineage. The churn of noble DNA had thrown up to the position of ruler of Austria, the Low Countries, and Holy Roman Emperor a himbo. Maximilian tried with all his might to fulfill the potential of his titles, but his military campaigns against the French in Italy and Provence failed, leaving him deeply in debt and forced to make concessions to the princes of the empire. Near the end of his life, he made peace with his own failures, instead resting his hopes for ultimate Habsburg ascendancy on the narrow shoulders of his grandson.
Charles of Habsburg was born in Ghent, in modern-day Belgium, in February of the year 1500. We just ran through some of the Habsburg dynastic bullshit earlier, but from the perspective of Charles, let's look at it one more time. His paternal grandparents were Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor, and Mary of Burgundy, through whom the Habsburgs had gained control of the Low Countries. His maternal grandparents were Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. You know, the folks who unified the Spanish crown, funded Columbus, and began the transatlantic Spanish Empire. Charles was the son of their daughter Joanna and Philip, and as such became the Archduke of Austria, the King of Aragon and Castile, and the Duke of Burgundy by birthright. So in Charles we have the one Habsburg who now unifies all these realms, from Hungary to Portugal. Oh, and also, yeah, Naples is in there. I keep forgetting that the Naples and Sicily are their own little kingdom.
Tuck her down there, like, hey, we're around too.
We also see in his accumulation of these realms the same combination of strategy and luck that Habsburgs have been riding for a few centuries. He was the child of Joanna, Queen of Aragon and Castile, but she was only the third child of Ferdinand and Isabella. Luckily for Chuck, Joanna's older brother and sister both conveniently kicked the bucket in 1498. And with the death of Philip, Joanna conveniently went mad. She probably had some kind of mental breakdown, but was also pushed out of her position and locked away in the Palace of Tordesillas for almost 50 years. Similarly, with the Holy Roman Empire, Charles was able to leverage his German origin through the Low Countries in Austria, along with separate machinations from Pope Leo, to play France and Habsburgs off each other to secure an uncertain election to the emperor and become Charles V. For his election, we can thank Grandpappy Max, who borrowed huge sums of money from the aforementioned Fugger family of merchant bankers to persuade the electors to choose Charles over King Francis I of France and King Henry VIII of England to be the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. I know that this is the tough part of like listing this stuff.
It's going up the top of the roller coaster.
Yeah, I know. Like, but you got to set this stuff up to just get into like how insanely complicated this is and how unlikely it is to invest all this power into a singular person.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Bad system. Shouldn't do it. So why go through all this Baroque genealogy and family history and titles and possessions of whatever? Doesn't this all just lead to another bejeweled Burgundian king who can barely close his mouth? Well, we're looking at the process of consolidation that leads out of feudal dislocation and towards a modern centralized state. And in his lifetime, Charles was surfing the forward crest of that wave.
Now, threaded throughout Renaissance thought is the dream of a universal monarchy, of a single ruler who could quell the ceaseless and bloody dynastic conflict that defined European politics and bring about an era of peace and Christian fellowship. Thanks to Charles's position at the apex of dynastic power, those around him were quick to see in his person the fulfillment of that vision. His Italian tutor wrote to him as a child that God the Creator has given you this grace of raising you in dignity above all Christian kings and princes by constituting you the greatest emperor and king who has been since Charlemagne, your predecessor. Charles acknowledged these ambitions by choosing as his personal motto, plus ultra, meaning ever further. But he was always ambivalent about the actual prospect of universal monarchy. While his opponents, like the Pope and the King of France, often saw him as a continental menace, Charles's own vision of power was more circumspect. A significant reason for this was his status as Holy Roman Emperor and his fraught relationship with the imperial princes, who were quick to resist any moves that looked like they were designed to advance Habsburg power at the expense of their own.
So the political goals of the Habsburgs are linked with the political nature of the Holy Roman Empire, which brings us to one of the main engines of tragic historical comedy of this whole series, the hilariously absurd nature of the Holy Roman Empire. One of history's great political jokes.
It's a hell of a jalopy, that's for sure. It's amazing they got so many miles out of it.
You're slapping the top of the Holy Roman Empire going, you'll be amazed how many duchies you can fit in this thing. The whole entity was first established as a theoretical political continuation of the Roman Empire by Charlemagne as a Frankish empire, explicitly set as the protector of the papacy and defender of Christendom. Within a generation, though, it's really funny that Charlemagne's empire lasts 4 years or something?
I mean, it was all just proving a fact that nobody at the time could know, but that was eventually ratified by the very existence of the Holy Roman Empire, is that swath of land was ungovernable from a center.
Yes. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking in this series about the specific political sclerotic nature of the Holy Roman Empire. But, here is Charlemagne forging this huge territory that is basically modern France and Germany put together, and then it breaks in two. Why would you say France ends up like France and Germany ends up the stupid Holy Roman Empire?
To me, it boils down to geography. Essentially, they call France the hexagon because it is this hexagonal shape which has natural borders basically everywhere, from the Alps to the Pyrenees and then the coasts.
Yes.
It's the liminal spaces, the Low Countries, and of course that becomes this huge zone of contention and conflict and everything.
Right.
And it's unsecured, and that's why you hit the fucking 80 Years' War. But you have this relatively coherent thing that builds itself into a dynamic dynastic regime through this conflict over its territory with the English dynasty in the 100 Years' War, and eventually dominates this area, and then in the process of dominating that area, dominates it through this machine it had built to win that war. But to the west, the German lands are just this big valley. It's a series of river valleys. Mm-hmm. There is no natural boundary to anything. And so conflict sort of bleeds to a local level. It doesn't bring power into concentration to compete at higher levels of social complexity and population size. So you just get petty, smaller groups with a weaker imperial authority at the center.
Yeah, and the imperial authority that just is this vestige of an authority that once was, that has no practical relationship to anything going on then. And like we were just talking about before we started recording, what the technical difference between like a landgrave and a margrave is.
Yes, I don't know if we've talked about this. I don't think we
have not on the show.
So a landgrave is essentially a count. He's a feudally recognized lord over a parcel of land. He's got legal rights there. He's got feudatory rights. And then the margrave is a marcher lord, as in a military commander of a border area. One of the emperor's police officers, basically, of these little zones, because you need those because these are literally disputed areas. And over time, those just calcified into these hereditary dynasties that drew feudal rents, basically, and then waged war and waged politics and did the Reformation in the pursuit of those interests. But you got to remember, though, when you say that France is this dynamic centralizing authority. That is only in comparison to Germany.
It's still a nightmare.
It is still a nightmare of regional powers and local semi-autarkic noble clans, basically, similar to Spain in that respect. But it is just a vastly more coherent state, capable of more coordinated power projection than anything that emerges in Germany.
So within a generation of Charlemagne, this great legendary king uniting all this stuff, it was split apart and then later reunited many times over. The geographic center of the empire moved east as the Frankish lands to the west became the Kingdom of France. The emperor's extremely weak authority had spiraled over the next several centuries, resulting in the pool of smaller authorities fragmenting the empire. To begin, and this is from C.V. Wedgwood here, who is a major source for this series, her 30 Years War book is basically the Bible. So I want to shout her out now because we'll be borrowing liberally from her work throughout this. Quote, "Foreign rulers held fiefs within the empire. The King of Denmark was the Duke of Holstein, and the great and scattered estates which made up the whole section of the empire known as the Burgundian Circle were virtually independent under the King of Spain. Direct vassals of the emperor, such as the Elector of Brandenburg, held lands outside the empire and independent of imperial authority. The system had long ceased to conform to any known definition of a state. Primogeniture was not established until much later in the HRE, so lands were divided and subdivided among noble offspring. We talked about this in the last episode. Whereas in Western Europe, where noble second and third sons had to settle for positions in the church or the royal bureaucracy, in the empire, they could inherit, leading to a de-evolutionary cycle of lands being broken up until small principalities could be broken down to little more than a village and a noble's hunting lodge. Then there were the free imperial cities, which could range in size from a province like Nuremberg to little more than an orchard with a wall around it. Then there were lands claimed by knights or wealthy merchants who pledged loyalty only to the emperor. On top of that were the ecclesiastical lands, a whole constellation of abbeys, monasteries, and prince-bishoprics owing loyalty to the Catholic Church, which again could scale to the size of small provinces or smears of tiny estates separated by hundreds of miles of distance. Thus, again from Wedgwood, a population of 21 million depended for its government on more than 2,000 separate authorities. Even if you take the broadest base of confederations of the knights, imperial cities, and other tenants of the emperor, there are at least 300 conflicting authorities in Germany. So, the at least semi-ironic proclamation that the emperor was the, quote, King of Kings. Yes, he wore the crown, but what did he rule?
The Holy Roman Empire was defined by the inability to centralize institutions of authority, to cohere and assert power. The geographic and geopolitical conditions that animated politics west of the Alps were lacking. The German lands were a huge basin defined by river systems, unbound in the way of Iberia or the Frankish Hexagon or the British Isles. The high nobles of the empire had been first invested with power by Charlemagne, and with the collapse of the Carolingian dynasty that followed him, were able to guard their princely authority from any attempts by subsequent powers to claw it back. The Middle Ages saw a repeated cycle of noble unrest, and in each case, the path of least resistance for the emperor was to make peace by offering concessions, recognizing princely rights that in other lands would have been monopolized by the monarch. These concessions were always put on paper, meaning that Germany boasted the most developed constitutional structure and body of legal theory of any European polity. Literacy at this point was a technology of elite power projection and negotiation. Princes of the empire had the right to administer justice, collect taxes, even mint currency on their own lands. By the 13th century, the most powerful of these princes, the descendants of the imperial court office holders, had secured the right to elect their emperor. The three ecclesiastical emperors were the Archbishop of Maine, Cologne, and Trier. The secular ones were the Count Palatine of the west, the Duke of Saxony in the east, and the Margrave of Brandenburg in the north.
It's funny that even within this electoral thing, it's three different titles of people. It's like a prince and a margrave.
We got a duke, we got a margrave, we got a count.
Yeah, a count, a margrave, and a duke walk into a bar.
Yeah, a count, a duke, and a margrave walk into the Erfurt latrine. But later, the Duke of Bohemia was added to complete the seven. The authority of these seven electors to choose the emperor was codified, along with all the other rights and privileges of the German of the German nobility in the Golden Bull of 1356. Again, great name for a document. While this structure left the emperor weak, it also allowed the aristocracy, as prone to feuding amongst each other over land and power as anywhere else, more likely to pursue their conflicts through the various imperial courts and parliaments than through open violence. The emperor's most vital function was to serve as the impartial arbiter of these sort of disputes.
It's also funny that at imperial elections, it was customary for the newly elected emperor to read out loud this entire centuries in the making collection of rules, privileges, and codified hierarchies, which could apparently take hours. Certainly a snooze fest for all involved, but I can imagine it as one little humiliation to prove who the emperor really worked for.
Yeah, you just got to make him shake it a little bit.
Yeah, they should. The president should have to read the Constitution at the.
Absolutely, you should have to do it while clapping cheeks. Emperor Maximilian made his play for greater leverage over the estates of the empire, but ended up deeply in debt to German bankers and forced to make further concessions to the estates instead. While other European dynasties were consolidating power through central administration, the empire established a system of independent administrative circles called creases. The imperial parliament was rechristened the Reichstag. Competing imperial and regional court systems were introduced, all of this leaving Charles V to inherit a composite empire which contained in Spain one of the most powerful centralized dynastic states, and in the Holy Roman Empire something that couldn't be called a state at all.
So then by 1519, we've got the setup for this fascinating conflict. Charles V was now at the top of one of the largest, most powerful dynastic political entities Europe had seen since Charlemagne 700 years earlier. But at its center, his top title, Emperor, he's got this hilariously ramshackle domain in the Holy Roman Empire, divided among 2,000 little noble demons all nipping at him for more control, more autonomy, more privileges. And into that mix, you have the absolute boy from episode 1, Martin Luther, detonating the nuclear bomb of Reformation into the heart of Charles's domain. If you remember from the last episode, Charles condemns Luther as an outlaw at the Diet of Worms in 1521, but lets him go, after which he is conveniently kidnapped into the protection of Frederick the Wise of Saxony. Luther and Protestantism then spread among the princes of Germany, becoming the ideological wedge through which they assert independence from Charles, the great defender of Catholicism. Matt, do you have any perspective on this from Charles's point of view?
So Charles had, to put it mildly, a different relationship to the Catholic Church than Martin Luther did. Not only was he schooled from birth by high officials within the church, the concept of universal monarchy that swirled around him was meaningless without the complementary concept of a universal church. Luther's insistence on his individual prerogative to challenge centuries of church teachings made the prospect of continental harmony impossible. Charles's reply to Luther's heartfelt theological dissent at Worms was to proclaim that a single monk must err if his opinion is contrary to all that of Christendom.
Who do you think
honestly,
you are, dude?
That's kind of a good argument.
Yes.
I mean, that's not a bad point, Charles.
But Charles was no intellectual, but we'll get into this, but he's kind of a drip of a character, but I kind of like the element that comes through of him of just like exasperation of like, what am I supposed to do with this?
He took from a young age seriously this mantle and obligation as like a thing to organize himself around, but he was just never that really into any of it.
Yeah.
And that's kind of poignant.
It is. It's like being one of the most powerful people in world history, but then just kind of going through it like it's a day job.
Yeah, just getting dragged around from siege to siege, getting bigger and bigger hemorrhoids.
Yeah.
And accomplishing absolutely nothing.
And then you got this world-class thinker throwing all these arguments at you, and you're like,
come on, man.
I've got an empire to run.
How about we calm down a little bit?
Yes.
Like you know everything now?
Yes.
I mean, that honestly is a decent fucking rebuttal. And Protestantism, one of the things we can blame it on is the creation of a way to say, actually, no, that's not true.
Yes.
So, the Spanish blood in his veins came from a lineage of Catholic warriors who were, in his words, defenders at all times of the Catholic faith, its sacred ceremonies, decrees and ordinances, and his holy rites. While Charles was sensitive enough to the interests of princes like Frederick the Wise to resist the counsel of his advisors who told him to seize and burn Luther, Jan Hus style, he clamped down on the spread of Luther's heresy in any territory under his direct control.
So all during this time that Charles is struggling against the Reformation in Germany, He's also fighting a protracted and bloody series of conflicts for control over Italy, attempting to expand Habsburg imperial domination into the Italian peninsula.
Where a ton of the money was. This is where the early trade networks of medieval Europe were built. The early fortunes, the early commercial fortunes are built. And this conflict over those resources is part of why that center of gravity shifts northward to the Rhineland and to the Low Countries, because it is essentially destroyed in this contest.
This will become more important later, but one of the critical geographic formations here is known as the Habsburg Road. That's literally
the Spanish Road.
The Spanish Road is like a series of passes that basically directs money upwards from the Italian peninsula up through the Alps and into the Low Countries.
And also provides the key transportation infrastructure for sending troops from Spanish garrisons in Spain and in northern Italy through Switzerland and into the Low Countries.
Right. So this north-south axis of power, that's why that's critically important and why Charles is focused on it.
Yeah.
The Habsburgs' main rivals here are the Valois kings of France, and the conflict between these two dynasties is going to be one of the main engines of European politics way into the next century. The Italian wars continue off and on for over 60 years and have an insane series of victories, defeats, alliances, and double crosses from all sides. The King of France gets captured in battle and held in Spain at one point. The Pope switched sides back and forth between the Habsburgs and the French at various points in order to check the ambitions of one or the other. Rome is sacked by a bunch of delinquent German mercenaries running out of control under Charles V. Even the Ottomans under King Suleiman the Magnificent get involved and work with the French in one of the first crossover Christian-Muslim alliances in European history.
Legendary collab.
Yeah, legendary collab. Valois x Suleiman.
So the reason that this becomes the terrain of conflict in this period is that the Italian city-states were the most economically dynamic part of Europe. They were the key nodes in a rich east-west trading network that went from the Silk Road to the North Sea. And managing that created vast banking fortunes, complicated technological instruments of exchange, concepts like double entry bookkeeping.
I always see that brought up as like one of the technological innovations of the Venetians.
You think, how is it that hard to think of
be
that?
like one column says what you spend, one column says what you get.
How the hell did
that take until like the
How did it take you that long? Again, no need for it.
Yes.
Because you didn't have the intensity of economic activity that required the technological abstraction.
To think two columns.
Exactly. It didn't occur to you. Why would you do it if you didn't need to? What kind of sicko would do double entry bookkeeping if they didn't need it?
Right.
And these would be crucial to creating the social organism that we're talking about of capitalism. But the thing that made them efficient was their small size, their small population that could be disproportionately urbanites who could live off of the fruits of these merchant endeavors and sit around all day and do politics and do diplomacy and build abstract instruments of capital accumulation.
And didn't have to worry about the deferring to some hereditary dipshit king and his even more dipshit kid who's got to have his own prerogatives and stuff like that. They just got your town council.
They didn't have to kick up a bunch of money.
Yeah.
They didn't have to blow a bunch of cash on keeping up the livelihoods of a bunch of fancy lads whose consumption is otherwise the only engine of economic growth. Like in the feudal era, you say like, well, where did the demand come from? The demand was entirely concentrated at the top, and it was in luxury.
Yes.
Spending all capital instead of reinvesting it.
Which is why you can still go to museums and see those gigantic tapestries or whatever, because that was what was getting made with anybody's money.
In Burgundy, which becomes the place that capitalism really comes into fluorescence with the Dutch Republic, the Dukes of Burgundy had these pleasure gardens filled with mechanical devices, mechanical musical fountains that had little mechanical scenes of like animals dancing around and shooting. They had like squirt, when you press the doorbell and you get a squirt of water. Like they had like prank squirt guns made out of like tubing running through these things. That was what they spent money on. That's what they spent all the money on. These guys in these Italian city-states, they're stacking cash in their little competitive framework, these little micro states at the perfect level of efficiency. But all that wealth draws in these powers that are less efficient, more reliant on that extractive feudal relation, but as a result have this massive military capacity.
Right.
So they come in and they're going to fight over these spoils. And in so doing, they're going to basically destroy the capacity of the Italian city-states to become the place where capitalism does establish itself as the hegemonic social relationship that it will become. They lose it, and the viral infection, if you will, travels north up the Rhine,
right,
eventually settling in the Dutch lowlands
and
in the southern England.
And we're not going to be able to spend too much time talking about northern Italy, but it's just basically one giant conflict until Napoleon comes in and cleans it all up.
Yeah. So what we're going to see this horrifying war is this awful, bloody attempt to secure this area, and it's just this huge expulsion of blood and treasure, and this massive devastation of the entire area that it never really recovers from.
Right.
During the course of his rule, Charles V fought in Germany, in Spain, in France, Hungary, and the Balkans, in North Africa. He had forces in North and South America, but the place he fought longest and hardest was in Italy. The Italian Wars, in which Charles pressed Habsburg hereditary claims to territories in northern Italy and Naples against the French crown and occasionally the papacy, were the axis around which the entire Habsburg dynastic state turned. Silver extracted from the earth at gunpoint from the New World and by feudal right in Europe went to pay for a war that gripped Italy in 60 years of spasmodic violence. The French Valois monarchy, with its huge population and massive agricultural output, was the only dynasty that could stand toe-to-toe with the Habsburgs, with their own hereditary claims to the rich commercial hubs of northern Italy and the breadbasket of the south. In the words of Florentine lawyer Francesco Guicciardini, the results were a flame, a pestilence which has entered Italy. By war's end, he observed they had overturned states and their forms of government, as well as their ways of making war. Both dynasties, allied to ever-shifting coalitions of Italian princes, including the Pope, paid for bigger and bigger mercenary armies to rampage across the peninsula. When the war began in the 1490s, a large army consisted of around 20,000 men. By the time it ended in the 1550s, that number was 40,000. The process of peasant dispossession and urbanization that defined the era ensured a ready supply of unattached young men willing to fight for pay and plunder. This massive concentration of resources into the military machine helped spark a revolution in military technology that made the business of war vastly more expensive and more destructive than had ever been the case in history. The armored, mounted aristocratic knights of the Middle Ages were replaced by hired commoners who made up for their lack of years of personalized military training with more potent weapons. Portable firearms, the arquebus and the musket.
The arquebus,
one of the best named weapons in history. And it's so funny to say.
Arquebus.
Oh,
arquebusiers.
Some guy rolling up to you with a slow match burning. Portable firearms, the arquebus and the musket, which were powerful enough to punch through plate armor, multiplied the lethality of the common soldier, along with the adaptation of the mass pike formation to neutralize the power of cavalry.
Pike and shot, baby, pike and shot.
Yep. Artillery pieces became much bigger and more powerful, which necessitated the development of new fortification designs to withstand the heavier bombardment. One of the most noteworthy of these architectural innovations was the angled bastion, called the Tres Italiane for its place of origin, meant to deflect cannonballs rather than absorb them.
The Star Fort.
Yes, baby. The importance of protecting these fabulously expensive pieces of military equipment meant that sieges replaced pitched battles as the main points of contact in warfare. Paying for all this was a constant challenge. Even if the silver mines of Peru were sufficient to pay for it all, the means of distributing payment to troops in the field were too crude to facilitate it. Instead, Charles V borrowed heavily from banking families in the commercial capitals of the empire, such as the Fugger family of Augsburg, against the future output of royal mining operations and feudal tithes. In this way, the war stimulated the creation of even more complex financial instruments, but it still wasn't enough to keep the gears of war from stripping. The armies of the Italian war were often left without pay for months. It was one such unpaid army, nominally under the command of the Holy Roman Emperor, that sacked Rome in 1527, and whose German Protestant troops carved the name Martin Luther into the walls of the Vatican.
Oh, man.
This historic irony, man. It's
it really
delicious.
is. We didn't mention this in the Martin Luther episode, but Martin Luther took precisely one trip outside of Germany.
He went to Rome when he was before the Reformation. When he was just a humble monk, he visited Rome and he did the
penance on the stairs.
Penance on the stairs. He prayed for his grandfather or something. And in later years, he said that he was traumatized by the decadence, but we don't know if that was true at the time.
Yeah, apparently he went there and was like, "This is what all the money's going towards.
Right.
All these fancy lads, these royal papists." So
we don't know. We have no idea how much he was thinking of it in those terms at the time, but I think it's suffice to say he probably didn't have a great time. Since he fled back to Italy and Germany and stayed there
never
his whole
left.
life.
Yes, exactly. And then 20 or 30 years later, there are a bunch of German mercenaries carving his name into the walls there.
Unbelievable. This churn of carnage, which could never be fully resolved as the two main combatants were too powerful to be entirely defeated by one another, left deep scars across Italy and the entire continent as veterans of the conflict returned to tell their countrymen of the grim, impersonal, unheroic face of modern warfare. The heroic narrative of chivalric combat that had been crucial in affirming the legitimacy of the feudal system was drowned out in the crash of cannon fire. The surge to the French forces besieged by the Habsburgs at the Castle of Hedon in 1553 described the horror of an artillery bombardment thusly. Now, through the diabolical tempest of the echo from these thundering instruments, and by the great and vehement agitation of the collision of the air resounding and reverberating in the wounds of the hurt people, diverse died, and others because they could not rest by reason of the groans and cries that they made night and day, and also for want of good nourishment and other good usage necessary for wounded people. In such conditions, the fantasies of virtuous warfare that had sustained the military aristocracy of high feudalism could not be sustained. The 1577 birthday festivities of Danish King Christian IV had no tournaments or jousts.
No tournaments
None.
or jousts?
Canceled.
Had his birthday?
Had his frickin' B-Day. According to theologian Erasmus Laetus, that was because chivalry was dead. And most things are decided through dissimulation and cunning. And when guns are appreciated above all other weapons, physical strength and military prowess have by nature lost all their former luster, since the bravest, strongest, and most forceful men are torn away from this wretched world in their early youth, if not childhood. Only few opportunities are provided to show bravery when weapons have become no more than a shortcut to crime. War no longer revealed virtue.
Yes.
It destroyed it.
We might get into this later, that the 20th century, the two world wars are often thought of in some ways as a second 30 years
Indeed,
war.
yes.
And this crisis of the 20th century, of the death of any kind of heroism or virtue. But again, they're talking about this stuff in the 1400s.
It's cycles. Like we're seeing the emergence of a conception of the self that is brought into critical continent-wide crisis over and over again, generally by changing material conditions.
Right.
The overall cultural effect of the Italian Wars was to hasten the general sense of disillusionment with institutions that marked this era of accelerating class and social conflict. The emperor claimed to be the protector of the one true Catholic Church, while his troops stabled horses in St. Peter's Basilica. The French king, who also claimed the mandate of Charlemagne, allied with the infidel Turk, who threatened to overwhelm the continent and snuff out Christianity entirely. Armies, indifferent to leadership, followed the path of plunder and bloodshed wherever it led. Surely, thought more and more people across every strata of European society, God had rendered his judgment on the earth, and his vengeance was nigh.
The Italian Wars definitely sound like their own version of Hell on Earth, but it is really, this is the dress rehearsal for,
Indeed,
for the next century of
conflict. It builds the
conflict.
capacities that are unleashed continent-wide.
Yeah, this is really more than the birth of a new thing. It is the death of a former type of war and capacity, and then the next version of it will be the even more destructive version of it.
And as in all cases, it will be wielded by people who do not understand the destructive capacity of the thing that they are working with.
Yes, exactly. Back in Germany, Charles's focus on fighting the Valois in Italy gave the Luther-curious princes even more room to breathe. The rapid spread of Protestantism had given them another tool to check Habsburg power in renouncing papal authority, decoupling the Habsburgs' assumed role as defenders of Christendom from their temporal authority over the empire. Major figures like Philip I, the Landgrave of Hesse, or John Frederick, Elector Saxony, John Sausage, of course.
Johnny Sausages.
Johnny Sausages,
Johnny Sausage.
Elector Saxony.
Hey, yes, Johnny Sausage.
They pushed the Protestant cause into their regions. And, of course, there was another benefit to Protestantism. If you decide the Catholic Church has no temporal authority, hey, look at all these ecclesiastical lands in your realm that just became ungoverned. Folks,
It's free real estate.
it's free real estate.
It's free real estate.
So the Reformation is accompanied by a mass confiscation of lands. And remember, we're still operating off a system where land equals power. So bogged down in Italy and dependent upon the consent of Lutheran princes to fund a war with the Ottomans in Hungary, Charles was unable to suppress heresy in the empire with force. Instead, he relied on the empire's legal structures to contain the damage. Catholic princes still held the majority within the estates. In 1529, an imperial diet reaffirmed the Edict of Worms, banning Luther and proclaimed a limitation on any further religious change. 14 Lutheran princes and cities issued an official protestation against the ruling. It was clear to these Protestants. Do you get it?
That's
This is what they were protesting.
This is what they're protesting.
Yes, that the emperor would not rest until the tide of religious dissent had been reversed. By 1531, these princes had came together to create a formal diplomatic and military alliance. The delightfully named Schmalkaldic League.
Schmalkaldic League.
The Schmalkaldic League, named after the Thuringian town of, wait for it, Schmalkalden.
Isn't it wonderful? We love Germany, don't we, folks?
Yes, all these goofy unions. The Schmalkaldic League was anchored by Philip and Elector John Frederick. The league collected members of lesser principalities and eventually another elector when Frederick III of the Palatinate joined. While Charles was occupied fighting in Italy, the Schmalkaldics got over a decade of relative freedom to pursue the Reformation, to pursue church confiscations, of building alliances and armies, just Protestant things.
Just Protestant things. Protestant boys being boys. So after signing the Peace of Crepy with France in 1544, that's right, it was a pretty crappy peace, Charles was able to finally turn his attention to defeating Protestantism in the empire once and for all. And he was able to do it with the help of an unlikely ally. Now, by this time, the Albertine-Wettin branch. Remember, we're talking about the Wettins.
They got split across. There's the two parts of Saxony.
Yes. So the Albertine-Wettin branch controlled the Duchy of Saxony, the richer but less electorally powerful one, had all converted to Protestantism like the Wettins of electoral Saxony had. But Duke Maurice, cousin of Elector John Frederick, Johnny Sausage, and the son-in-law of Philip of Hesse, refused to join the league. He was feuding bitterly with his cousin at the time over tax revenues of a county that they both jointly administer. Because the thing about feudal rights is that they were bilateral and overlapping.
Yeah.
A single piece of property or a single element of the system had multiple claims to it.
Yes.
It led to a lot of feuding and argument. The kind of thing that the emperor is supposed to adjudicate,
but in this has case, no authority to do
has
so.
Lost his ability and legitimacy to do so. So since Duke Maurice is feuding with John Frederick over these tax revenues, he refuses to join the league. Charles replies by officially placing John Frederick under the imperial ban in 1546, and appoints Maurice to enforce the ban.
Yes,
with the understanding that Maurice would claim John Frederick's title of elector as a reward. Now, after some wavering, Maurice eventually raises troops and, along with the imperial army under Charles and his brother Ferdinand, destroys the army of the Schmalkaldic League and his cousin at the Battle of Mulberg. Both Philip of Hesse and John Frederick of Saxony are taken prisoner. The Wittenberg printing press, which had been brought with the League army in the hopes of spreading the word of a Protestant victory, was confiscated. Notable reformers like Martin Bucer were forced to flee the empire for countries like England, taking the Reformation with them. Now, the most recalcitrant Protestants held out in the imperial city of Magdeburg, resisting an imperial siege for over a year. But elsewhere, Charles was finally free to impose a religious settlement. True to form, it wasn't a brutal reinstitution of Catholicism. Charles recognized that things had gone too far for that. Mm-hmm. His chief interest was in diffusing religious difference as a source of disunity within the empire.
And again, it's more of this like Charles attitude of just like, come on, guys,
want stability.
Just stop fighting.
His eyes are on Italy. They've been on Italy the whole time. This is just a brush fire that he would like to put out. And the Augsburg Interim, proclaimed at the 1548 Diet of Augsburg, proved this by reimposing the sacraments, but allowing Protestant clergy to marry and lay people to receive both bread and wine and communion. It's the beginning of a process that Charles hoped would result in Protestantism being contained through special dispensation the same way Ultraquist Hussites had been a century earlier.
We'll just make a new form of Catholicism that exists inside Germany and just we're all still the same guys.
Exactly. Luther had died a year before imperial troops marched into Wittenberg, but his small bean heir apparent, Philip Melanchthon, who hated confrontation as much as Luther loved it, proved a reluctant but effective collaborator in the project of creating a digestible version of Protestant theology. But the contagion had by this point spread too far, and in the eyes of the princes, the work of politically neutralizing Protestantism was too enmeshed with the greater work of a Habsburg dynastic aggrandizement that could only come at their expense. Duke Maurice, seeing the failure of the interim to demobilize Protestant resistance and sick of getting called a traitor everywhere he went, forged a military alliance with the King of France and launched a combined offensive against the Catholic forces of the empire that sent Charles fleeing Vienna just ahead of a conquering army. Duke Maurice, the guy, loved a heel turn. Or a face turn, depending on your stance on indulgences.
But, all this stuff, again, we have to get through a lot of, petty dynastic infighting and
Absolutely.
squabbling
It's what stirs
here.
the sauce.
Yes. But I think that's important to point here is seeing, even 30 years after, Protestantism developed as a theological quibble, how, impossibly interlinked it is with, the political fortunes of these dynasties. That it's basically, within a half generation of its creation, a purely political tool.
Yeah, it is. All questions are dominated by expediency, as especially religious ones.
Which is, again, a funny pairing with all these guys who are having nervous breakdowns about whether bread is God or not.
Yep, because they don't have any real work to do. Because they get to hang around in their fucking monasteries all day.
Yes.
They don't have any real responsibility.
They don't have Charles V's headache of governing this stupid empire.
Exactly. But, of course, the empire being the empire, ungovernable as it is, even with this, the Schmalkaldic League, is still unable to secure a complete victory. And the final outcome of all this bloodshed was 1555's Peace of Augsburg.
I feel like I'm just trying to highlight everything that's going to show up on the AP Eurotest.
We should honestly put an air horn behind every one of these things. Every edict, every peace.
Yes, exactly.
Every golden bull. And the Peace of Augsburg acknowledged the fact of religious stalemate. It acknowledged the reality that nobody was going to impose themselves on this polity. As we said, can't be done. The peace formally legalized Protestantism where it had already taken root. Protestantism, defined that is, by those who adhered to the Lutheran Articles of Faith, known as the Confessions of, you guessed it, Augsburg. So you got a Peace of Augsburg,
a Confession
of Augsburg. There's some others. It's a very key. There's a comment at one point. Now, that pointedly excluded adherence to the nascent Calvinist Reformed Church movement, which will be a problem later on.
Yes.
But later on was later on. The agreement did the work of bringing peace to the empire and kicking the can of religious reckoning down the road for a generation, which is all the institutions of the Holy Roman Empire were really capable of.
Yes.
Augsburg enshrined the principle of cuius regio, ius religio, I believe, meaning whose realm, their religion.
You guys figure it out.
This meant that the princes who had embraced Lutheranism by 1555 had the right to enforce it as the reigning faith of their lands. The same going for Catholic princes. People stuck living under an incompatible religious regime had the right of emigration. Both sides assented to the peace with the hope that God would, in the fullness of time, reveal his preference and reward his faithful.
It's all right, so we're just leaving it up to the princes now, and just presumably in another 100 years or so, God's just going to
Jesus is going to show up. He's going to pick us. We're going to go to Chuck E. Cheese.
Defeated by the Schmalkaldics, the Peace of Augsburg, signed by his brother Ferdinand on his behalf, Charles was spent. And in 1556, he abdicated the imperial throne. His 37-year reign had been exhausting. At his abdication in Flanders, he recounted, "I have been 9 times to Germany, 6 times to Spain, and 7 to Italy. I have come here to Flanders 10 times, and have been 4 times to France in war and in peace, twice to England, and twice to Africa, without mentioning other lesser journeys. I have made 8 voyages in the Mediterranean and 3 in the seas of Spain. It is wild to imagine that itinerary across 16th century European roads in all climates, on horseback, and often carried in a litter due to gout. But now he was done. The last words of his speech: "My life has been one long journey."
What a long, strange trip it's been.
Yes. It's something unforgettable, but in the end, it's
I hope you've
right.
had the time of your life, Chuck.
Again, I feel like I mentioned this above. I had a little trouble getting into the character of him, but at the end of this, I do kind of feel for the guy. He was given an impossible task and impossible expectations.
He does what he thinks is the honorable thing, which is he takes as read what his family expects from him and just tries to carry it out. That is duty.
Yes.
It, of course, encompasses monstrosity beyond our understanding, particularly in the colonial endeavors in New America.
That is true.
But at the same time, you feel for his sense of just being trapped.
Yes. Like he basically exists just to keep saying yes to everyone around him.
Yeah.
Charles split his empire between his son and his brother. To his son Philip went the Spanish possessions. Spain. Philip the Deuce.
Philip the Second.
To his son Philip went the Spanish possessions. Spain, the Americas, Naples, Sicily, his conquests in Milan. To his brother Ferdinand went Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and the other German possessions. Ultimately, Charles V Habsburg is about as close as Europe ever comes to a universal monarch. And he just couldn't do it. He couldn't get the job done. But given his personality and his historical moment, it's easy to see why. Charles was, if nothing else, a faithful servant to God's demands. AEIOU, the rule of the world from his birthright in Austria in the name of the one true God. And as I was just saying, you put a guy like that in the driver's seat of the Habsburgs in 1519, and he's not just exercising imperial will or making a crass grab for dynastic power. He is doing what the Lord God commands of him.
Indeed. The random churn of dynastic succession had thrown up Charles V into a position of unprecedented power. For the Habsburgs, this was the hand of God moving the pieces into place to finally bring peace to Christendom. To his enemies, it was the work of Satan. For Charles, it was mostly an often literal pain in the ass. A mediocre ruler with a mediocre mind, Charles is no way matched the enormity of the position he found himself in. His grand strategy was a desultory game of continental whack-a-mole. When dealing with restive vassals or foreign enemies, his first instinct was conciliation. He was willing to agree to anything that would buy him a moment's breathing space that never materialized, as every other dynasty in Europe oriented their foreign policy around neutralizing Habsburg ambition. But even if Charles had been a world historical genius, it's unlikely he could have realized those ambitions. Europe, and the German lands at its heart, had resisted centralized authority since the fall of Rome. No regime possessed the resources or the technological application of resources necessary to impose its will across a geographic expanse dominated by small and medium-sized powers, all of them capable of defending their authority on a relatively equal material footing. All of Charles's expensive, bloody machinations only served to set the stage for more catastrophic violence in the years to come, violence that would necessitate the emergence of a power finally capable of dominating the continent.
So, Matt, do you think that there is a strategy that Charles could have had to actually win here? If he had only focused on the Reformation, could he have crushed it? If he had only focused on Italy, could he have taken it?
I would say that, well, the thing is, he kind of did take Italy. I mean, we talked about the Italian Wars as this like ceaseless stalemate of this bloody changing of hands back and forth. But at the end of the Italian Wars, Spain held control of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies,
right,
and the Duchy of Milan and Genoa.
Yeah.
So they had done well and had positioned themselves as the preeminent continental power.
Right.
But they had not been able to turn that, obviously, into a real
unified kingdom,
a real actualized imperial project.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because they were breaking apart in the center. And the pulling away of the Spanish Netherlands is probably even more important than the breaking away of the German princes.
We'll get to that.
So when we consider how central Luther is to this as an individual, and really like the number of options he had to try to nip this in the bud, I do think that if he had sort of called the bluff of the nascently Protestant princes, he could have maybe decapitated this thing. Because as we said in the previous episode, it was the urban populations that first and most assiduously adopted Luther's critique. Mm-hmm. The princes, even Frederick the Wise, stood relatively aloof. Mm-hmm. It was only after the Peasants' War that they all decided that there was going to be some sort of reformation, and they wanted it to be
on their terms,
a magisterial one.
Yes.
So if at the Diet of Worms, when you have this Luther curious aristocracy, if he had essentially called their bluff
and been like, you do this and I'm going to fucking kill you,
and as part of that killed Luther, there's a good chance they could have stood down, because they were definitely unnerved by the way the Protestantism was spreading in the cities, who were their natural opponents for power within the empire.
Yeah.
So they were already nervous and skeptical of it.
Yeah.
That could have very well made them realize that the smart move was allying with the emperor.
Yes.
But at the end of, I hate to use a sports cliche, but at the end of the day, Charles fundamentally didn't have the confidence, as somebody who had just been introduced into the imperial throne,
right?
Who had his grandfather, just by the skin of his teeth and the grace of the Fugger family, fund this massive bribe to get him into that position on a very narrow location. He had just had to put down a rebellion in Spain when he was installed as king there.
A noble rebellion.
Who tried to impose, tried to support, I think, his cousin. He was on a very, very gingerly foundation to begin with, and just, I think more than anything, did not feel that he could confidently assert his imperial prerogative.
In the end of the day, he lacked the fundamentals.
That's true. But yes, if he'd done that, maybe he's able to forge an actual machine that can, turn conquests in Italy into enduring power bases.
I'm continually trying to highlight why we're trying to tell this story, but it's just very interesting when you have a hyper strong centralized authority where all the actual instruments of administration are grinding to a halt around them,
I do think, though, that in that context where he nips Protestantism in the butt, it emerges maybe a generation later in the Low Countries or England.
Yes.
Or both at the same time, probably.
Yeah. It seems like a force that is bound to happen at some point.
But of course, if you have that kind of delay, that just changes things so drastically that you're in a completely different universe.
Because, of course, as I highlighted earlier, the entire course of the development of the Reformation is completely wrapped up in the particular dynastic struggles of this very particular political institution of the Holy Roman Empire, and it's impossible to see how it develops otherwise.
Indeed.
Anyway, Charles retired to the quiet monastery of Yusta in Estremadura in Spain, where he died shortly after in 1558. If you look up pictures of it, it seems quite serene and idyllic. He spent his years there taking apart timepieces and then having his servants try to get them to tick in unison. Unsubtle to the end, but a peaceful death for a ruler who had spent a lifetime in armed conflict, whose reign was funded by the most brutal periods of conquest and domination of indigenous Americans. And of course also, the slow death of the feudal system that had produced Charles, as his consolidation of empire crashes up against the unconsolidatable German princes.
The failure of Charles of Habsburg's bid for universal monarchy meant that all of the escalating conflicts between classes and religious groups that defined European life would continue undermining all institutional foundations and cultural cohesion without any presiding authority to channel or diffuse them. Instead, open warfare between and within polities increased as the radically destabilizing force of the Reformation brought confessional violence to every corner of Western Europe.
And so next week, we'll turn to the other kingdoms of Europe to continue setting up the pieces for the big conflict of 1618. Because if there wouldn't be a universal monarch, there was bound to be universal conflict.
Wonderful.
Hell on Earth is written by Matt Christman and Chris Wade. It's produced by me, Chris Wade, with editing from our co-producer Nick Quaz. Show art and animation is from the great Ben Clarkson, and you can find a supplemental interactive atlas for the series by John White over at hellonearth.chapotraphouse.com. Our theme music is by Nick Diamonds, with additional music by Alessandro Takeshi, John Aarons, Tyrant King, and Stale Cooper. Join us next week as we catch up with the kings and major dynasties of Europe up to 1618 and put all the pieces in place for the outbreak of 30 years of apocalyptic war.